Hey friends, tonight let's explore one of the strangest culinary rivalries in medieval history, where kings didn't just battle with swords but with poultry. You're standing in the smoky heat of a stone-walled feast hall. Spices sting your nose, a lute plucks somewhere behind you, and in front of you a peacock roasted whole, redressed in its own dazzling feathers and stuffed with songbirds. Yes, that's the vibe tonight. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments where and when you're tuning in from. It's always comforting to know who else is lying under the same sleepy stars. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the court of Charles VI of France, or maybe Richard II of England. Honestly, tonight they blend a little. Either way, you're in a place where banquets are more than meals. They are theater, they are diplomacy, they are edible power plays with gravy. The competition who can roast the weirdest bird. Not the biggest, not the tastiest. No, this is a game of avian pageantry, herons, peacocks, swans, cranes. If it can honk and look offended, someone's tried to roast it in public. And it's not just roasting, it's presentation. There are instructions in medieval cookbooks, real ones, about how to kill a swan gut. It roast it, then reassemble it so it looks like it's flying across the platter. Bonus points if you can light it on fire. Even more if it still has a little smug curve to its neck. One famous court menu describes a roast peacock, feathers glued back on beak lacquered gold and eyes made of black pepper pearls. The bird was perched on a sugar mountain surrounded by knights made of bread. This was food as pageant, food as diplomacy, food as a flex. Because here's the truth. Most guests at these feasts didn't even eat these birds. They were too tough, too old, or too decorative. The actual meal was probably simpler boiled capon pottage, maybe a trench of bread soaked in beef drippings. But the bird show. That's where a king said, I am power, I am taste. I can afford to waste food and call it art. And now let's add a dash of sensory chaos. Imagine the smell of scorched feathers clinging faintly to honey-roasted ham. The waxy flicker of torchlight glinting off a butter swan sculpture. You bite into a crusty roll and watch a goose parade by held aloft like a wedding cake. A few nobles clap, one falls asleep, a jester does cartwheels into the soup. This is normal. Medieval cookbooks like the famous form of curry were less about recipes and more about vibe. They assumed you already had a staff of 20 and access to spices worth more than your horse. They gave poetic instructions like, take a fowl and do thereto what is right. Helpful, but for all the flash, there's something tender here too. Feasting was seasonal, ritual, emotional. The weird birds weren't just weird for fun. They were seasonal symbols, migratory guests on the table. A swan could signal peace, a heron patience. Food spoke in codes, and sometimes the code said, we're still alive after winter, that deserves a flaming partridge. Historically speaking, here's your solid fact for the night. Roast peacock was so revered in medieval France that there was a separate oath ceremony where knights would swear vows over it. That's right. You put your hand on the poultry and promise to fight with honor. Your odd detail. The peacock meat was usually considered terrible, stringy, dry, and kind of fishy, but no one said that out loud. It was political poultry. And your academic debate. Some scholars argue that these bird displays were more about fear than flavor. That by roasting something rare and majestic, kings were performing dominance over nature itself. Others say it was just a great excuse to throw a party. Honestly, maybe both. Somewhere in this scene, a kitchen boy is sneaking an extra turnip from the hearth. Somewhere else, a falconer is whispering to his hawk. And you lucky sleeper are drifting between centuries on a slow-cooked current of feathers, fire, and flexing monarchs. And hey, don't worry, we haven't even gotten to the eels yet. You wake in the morning before the roast, which is to say before the kitchen awakens, before the grease glimmers, before a single ladle clangs or a single scullion complains. And yes, before the king begins wondering whether he can stuff a pheasant into a swan into a boar again, spoiler, he can. The floors are damp from last night's scrub. The hearth is sleeping, just a few coals curled like red mice. The air smells of soot mead and anxiety. Your job is to test the fire, to rouse the logs, and to pretend you know what you're doing. You don't, but you do it anyway, because that's what happens in castle kitchens. The show must roast on. Today's featured bird isn't just any bird. It's a capon. But not just any capon, it's one that's been massaged in butter, stuffed with cloves, and set aside under a tapestry so warm it might as well be a blanket. The steward says it's for the visiting duke. The cook says it's for theatrics. You suspect it's for whoever asks the loudest. In medieval banquets, the food didn't just nourish, it performed. You're tasked with helping prepare the bird for the spit. You don't stab it, heavens no. That's for someone older, grumpier, and insured. You fetch the rosemary peel garlic like it owes you money and smear a mixture of wine and mustard over the bird's pale, absurdly plump body. It smells glorious, like ambition and fear. Historically, capons were favored because they were castrated roosters. That's right. Medieval people loved soft meat, and capons, being hormone-free involuntarily, were tender and fattened more easily. Their texture was prized, especially in elite circles where subtlety was valued over chew. The kitchen's rhythm picks up. You hear clanging metal muttered prayers, a boy yelling about eels in the flour bin. No one seems surprised. Over in the corner, someone's sculpting a pie into the shape of a tower. Beside them, another cook is dyeing rice green with parsley juice. Everything is edible. Everything is weird. And then someone brings out the list. Oh yes, the list. It's the official banquet menu. Handwritten, flour-stained, smelling faintly of lavender and despair. You're allowed to glance, not read, but your eyes are fast. Swan and gold-leaf peacock redressed in feathers. Hedgehog-shaped meatballs with almond spines, jelly castle wiggles ominously. Something called blank manger that you pretend to understand, you sigh. You're going to need more firewood. Let's pause here for a moment. Did you know that in many medieval courts, food presentation was more important than taste? The more elaborate the dish, the more power it signified. A roasted bird that looked like a knight's helmet status. A fish served breathing well-faked prestige. It wasn't about the palate, it was about the poetry. And the money. Always the money. There's a joke in the kitchen: the king eats to show he's divine. The cooks eat because they're not. You sneak a taste of mustard sauce. You regret it immediately. It's like horseradish had an identity crisis. The kitchen is loud now. Someone's crying. Someone's laughing while crying. Someone is stuffing almonds into dates and then into a roast duck's beak for reasons unknown. The chaos is beautiful. Midway through the morning, the head cook arrives. Everyone stiffens. He inspects the capon, sniffs it, prods it, then nods. You've passed. Sort of. Lunch break is 5 minutes, during which you stare at a piece of hard cheese and wonder if it's plotting something. Now here's your historical fact. In 14th century England, royal feasts could feature up to 150 different dishes. Not 150 servings, 150 types. The logistics were staggering, the cost even more so. Feasts were a display of excess, but also of meticulous organization. Here's your quirky detail. Some birds were sewn back into their feathers after roasting, especially peacocks. That way they looked alive but tasted roasted. That's culinary necromancy, and you're just a humble kitchen hand in awe. And a question: did anyone actually enjoy these feasts? Or were they enduring them to maintain political image? Let that sit with you while you stoke the fire. The capon is turning now slowly, its skin glistening in the glow. Your arms are sore. Your apron smells of onion. But you, yes, you are part of the pageant. You smile. Because even if no one remembers your name, the bird will be perfect. And somewhere in a great hall filled with silk and candlelight, someone will taste that rosemary and wonder why it feels like home. You wake in the morning before the roast. which is to say before the kitchen awakens, before the grease glimmers, before a single ladle clangs or a single scullion complains. And yes, before the king begins wondering whether he can stuff a pheasant into a swan, into a boar again. Spoiler, he can. The floors are damp from last night's scrub. The hearth is sleeping just a few coals curled like red mice. The air smells of soot, mead, and anxiety. Your job is to test the fire, to rouse the logs, and to pretend you know what you're doing. You don't, but you do it anyway, because that's what happens in castle kitchens. The show must roast on. Today's featured bird isn't just any bird, it's a capon. But not just any capon, it's one that's been massaged in butter, stuffed with cloves, and set aside under a tapestry so warm it might as well be a blanket. The steward says it's for the visiting duke. The cook says it's for theatrics. You suspect it's for whoever asks the loudest. In medieval banquets, the food didn't just nourish, it performed. You're tasked with helping prepare the bird for the spit. You don't stab it, heavens, no. That's for someone older, grumpier, and insured. You fetch the rosemary peel garlic like it owes you money and smear a mixture of wine and mustard over the bird's pale, absurdly plump body. It smells glorious, like ambition and fear. Historically, capons were favored because they were castrated roosters. That's right. Medieval people loved soft meat, and capons, being hormone-free involuntarily, were tender and fattened more easily. Their texture was prized, especially in elite circles where subtlety was valued over chew. The kitchen's rhythm picks up. You hear clanging metal muttered prayers, a boy yelling about eels in the flour bin. No one seems surprised. Over in the corner, someone sculpting a pie into the shape of a tower. Beside them, another cook is dyeing rice green with parsley juice. Everything is edible. Everything is weird. And then someone brings out the list. Oh yes, the list. It's the official banquet menu. Handwritten, flour-stained, smelling faintly of lavender and despair. You're allowed to glance, not read. But your eyes are fast. Swan in gold leaf. Peacock redressed in feathers, hedgehog-shaped meatballs with almond spines, jelly castle wiggles ominously. Something called blank manger that you pretend to understand. You sigh. You're going to need more firewood. Let's pause here for a moment. Did you know that in many medieval courts, food presentation was more important than taste? The more elaborate the dish, the more power it signified. A roasted bird that looked like a knight's helmet status. A fish served breathing well-faked prestige. It wasn't about the palate, it was about the poetry. And the money. Always the money. There's a joke in the kitchen: the king eats to show he's divine. The cooks eat because they're not. You sneak a taste of mustard sauce. You regret it immediately. It's like horseradish had an identity crisis. The kitchen is loud now. Someone's crying. Someone's laughing while crying. Someone is stuffing almonds into dates and then into a roast duck's beak for reasons unknown. The chaos is beautiful. Midway through the morning, the head cook arrives. Everyone stiffens. He inspects the capon, sniffs it, prods it, then nods. You've passed. Sort of. Lunch break is 5 minutes, during which you stare at a piece of hard cheese and wonder if it's plotting something. Now here's your historical fact. In 14th century England, royal feasts could feature up to 150 different dishes. Not a 150 servings, 150 types. The logistics were staggering, the cost even more so. Feasts were a display of excess, but also of meticulous organization. Here's your quirky detail. Some birds were sewn back into their feathers after roasting, especially peacocks. That way they looked alive but tasted roasted. That's culinary necromancy, and you're just a humble kitchen hand in awe. And a question: did anyone actually enjoy these feasts, or were they enduring them to maintain political image? Let that sit with you while you stoke the fire. The capon is turning now slowly, its skin glistening in the glow. Your arms are sore. Your apron smells of onion. But you, yes, you are part of the pageant. You smile, because even if no one remembers your name, the bird will be perfect. And somewhere in a great hall filled with silk and candlelight, someone will taste that rosemary and wonder why it feels like home. Hi all, tonight we'll discover what happens when you put a medieval king near a kitchen, give him an ego the size of a cathedral, and ask him to invent dinner. The result? A festival of roasted absurdities, each more improbable than the last. Before we begin, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And if you're listening from a tiny village or a bustling city, let me know your time and place in the comments. Turn down the lights, perhaps start a fan to create a soothing ambiance, and join me as we slowly dive into tonight's story. You're at a feast, not just any feast. This is the Royal Autumn Banquet, held in a candlelit hall filled with gold-draped tapestries, sweet smoke, and people trying very hard not to faint in their corsets. There's music, sure, lutes, a harp, some sort of wheezing sack pipe, but the real centerpiece is the table. And on that table sits a peacock. Roasted, but not just roasted, its feathers were plucked and preserved only to be carefully reattached after the roasting. The effect is unsettling, majestic, slightly crispy. You don't know whether to eat it or salute it. That's the point. Because tonight isn't just about food, it's about spectacle. About who can roast the weirdest bird and get away with it. One king presents a swan stuffed with eels. Another counters with a goose inside a lamb, inside a pig, inside a cow, all roasted together, what modern folks might call a meat matryoshka. They call it revenge of the barnyard. Your host, the most extravagant of the monarchs, introduces a culinary invention known only as the singing hen. It's a cooked chicken with a bellows in its neck and a whistling pipe where the beak was. When you press it, it sings. Poorly. Historical truth time. There really were medieval competitions to serve increasingly absurd, ostentatious roasted animals at royal banquets. The goal wasn't nutrition, it was prestige, theater, and power. Wealth wasn't just worn, it was plated, flamed, feathered, and marched into the dining hall with trumpets. One documented dish involved sewing a deer back into its own skin after being roasted antlers and all, then adding gold leaf and setting it on wheels so it could be rolled into the feast like a majestic meat carriage. A bit much, absolutely, but you can't stop watching. You chew slowly on something called a barded quail, which is basically a small bird wrapped in bacon and poetry. The chef insists the poem was cooked into the meat. You nod politely and pretend to taste the metaphor. Nearby, someone is carving what appears to be a fish, but it breathes smoke. It's been stuffed with hot stones and herbs, a sort of medieval air freshener. The scent is confusing rosemary, mint, ambition, and just a hint of desperation. About 1,000 words, and let's stretch our legs with some light jokes. Medieval kings roasted birds not because they were hungry, but because therapy wasn't invented yet. If your dinner needs to be sewn back into its own skin and gilded, you might be overcompensating. Historians still aren't sure what one roast dish meant. The chef wasn't either, but it had 3 beaks. Back to our roast-a-thon. Someone suggests roasting an owl. You raise an eyebrow. It's quickly voted down on account of superstition. Owls are messengers of death and also impossible to pluck without severe judgment from the monastery. Instead, attention shifts to symbolic birds. The crane stands for vigilance, the heron nobility, the stork long-winded moral allegory. What no one mentions is that these animals were often rare, protected, or outright imported at absurd cost just for one bite. This wasn't about local cuisine, it was about imperial reach. Look at what I can make suffer for my dinner. Which brings us to our side fact: many birds used in these royal roasts were decorative only. They were too tough, too wild, or too magical in symbolism to eat, but they looked glorious under candlelight, especially when gilded. One anonymous poem from the 14th century describes a cockatrice, a mythical beast made by sewing a rooster's head onto a pig's body and roasting the whole thing. Not a great dinner, but a marvelous threat to your enemies. Academic debate time. Were these banquets really competitive, or were they collaborative performances among courts trying to outdo one another symbolically rather than literally? Some scholars argue the goal was to shock and delight, not necessarily to win. Others suggest it was a full-on cook-off, complete with judging, betting, and petty sabotage in the scullery. You lean back in your chair. The food parade continues. Out comes a roast pheasant wearing a paper crown. You don't ask questions. Out comes a pie, a massive one. Rumor says there's something inside, it moves. When the crust is cut, a flock of small birds fly out, blinking in confusion. Yes, that really happened. Surprise pies, live birds baked into an empty shell, then released at the table, were a genuine medieval trick. Though perhaps less about taste and more about the guest's ability to dodge droppings. Your plate is cleared, another is set. You now receive the garden bird, a roasted duck with its wings tied like a bouquet and a salad in its mouth. It's supposed to represent harmony between field and sky. You're mostly just impressed the salad isn't on fire. And now dessert is served. Roasted apples glazed in honey, pears poached in wine. Sugar sculptures of birds that look more alive than the real ones. A goose made of marzipan, a dove made of dates, a songbird made of rice and raisins. You're told each represents a kingdom, or a mood, or perhaps someone just got really into bird watching. By now your stomach is confused, your brain is tired, your heart is full. Because you've just survived a medieval king's banquet. You were fed spectacle, symbolism, satire, and maybe a feather or two. And as the hall quiets down and the lute plays something soft and sleepy, you remember. You weren't really there to eat. You were there to witness, to taste what power tried to taste like, to feel how absurd ambition can be when dressed in garlic and gold, and to know that no matter how strange your own kitchen might get, it's got nothing on the singing hen. The palace kitchens hum before dawn. You walk in on bare feet, the stone floor cool beneath you while torches flicker in sconces carved with wild boars and birds. This morning they are roasting a swan. But not just any swan, a gilded swan glazed in honey, spiced with cloves and stitched back into its feathered skin for display. It isn't meant to be eaten. It's meant to shock, because today is a royal banquet. And at this table, food isn't just sustenance, it's pageantry, politics, and subtle humiliation. You pass racks of game birds, each dressed up in miniature armor or with sugar helmets placed on their heads like crowns. There's a goose, stuffed with eels. A peacock with its tail restored and fanned like a royal standard. Even a roast boar wearing a lemon in its mouth as though to mock the notion of subtlety. And near the hearth a monk gently brushes gold leaf across the wings of the swan. His fingers are steady, reverent, as though this were a sacred ritual, not a culinary prank. You ask why. He says because this is a war of birds. You blink. He continues. Each noble house must outdo the last, more feathers, rarer meat, stranger stuffing. The one who shocks the loudest wins. So begins your education in medieval competitive roasting, where no banquet dish is too absurd, no ingredient too exotic, and no bird too sacred for satire. Let's talk about the roast heron with violet jelly. Yes, it was a thing. In some courts, this marshland bird, usually used as bait or ignored entirely, was elevated with dyed jellies to resemble royal purple. It wasn't tasty, but it was symbolic. Or take the roasted bittern, a bird whose booming call was said to predict storms. At one 14th century feast, it was served with lightning-shaped cuts of pastry, and guests were warned not to look it in the eye. No one questioned why. And of course there's the cockatrice, a horrifying hybrid, half piglet, half capon, sewn together and roasted as one beast. It was meant to represent unity, or confusion, or maybe just the cook's boredom. Each dish was a riddle, each roast a spectacle. A guest who didn't laugh or gasp was considered unworthy. This wasn't about enjoying food, it was about witnessing it. Now let's talk cost. Many of these birds came from far away, not just geese and pigeons, but cranes from the marshes, songbirds from Italy, even flamingos from Moorish ports. They were flown or marched, plucked and perfumed and posed like living statues. One recipe for a live roast involved placing a cooked songbird inside a hollow pie crust, then inserting a live one to fly out at cutting. Yes, this inspired nursery rhymes and nightmares. By now you're probably wondering, did people actually enjoy this? The answer is maybe. There are scattered complaints in records. One guest notes that his partridge was cold and powdery. Another laments a flaming swan which offered no meat but smoke, but no one dared speak too loudly, because insulting the roast bird was like insulting the host. And you don't survive long at court doing that, so instead guests performed delight. They giggled at the gilded gulls. They wept with joy at the hare in cherry sauce shaped like a bishop. They marveled at the roast crane carried in by 12 dancers, but later in the quiet they reached for bread. Plain simple soft inside, because in the end comfort still mattered. Even in a war of birds, there's one more thing, a secret. Sometimes these absurd dishes were not for the nobles, they were for the kitchen staff. A quiet rebellion, a roast goose stuffed with nothing but announced with great flair. A partridge filled with dry beans rattling as it was sliced. No one noticed, everyone applauded. Everyone. And the cooks, they smirked. Because they knew that roasting wasn't just cooking, it was storytelling. And sometimes the best stories are jokes. Historical fact. Royal feasts in medieval Europe often featured illusion foods including animals reassembled and redressed to shock or amuse. Quirky detail. The 15th century cookbook Le Ménager de Paris includes instructions for painting roasted birds with saffron and gold to resemble phoenixes. Scholarly question. Were these dishes expressions of power or signs of insecurity masked in luxury? Hi all, tonight we'll discover what happens when medieval kings get bored and have far too many birds at their disposal. If you've ever tried to impress someone by baking a pie, just wait until you hear what these monarchs stuffed into theirs. Warning, this may be the only time in your life you'll feel bad for a roasted peacock. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your time zone and location. We're a small but curious community. Dim those lights, fire up a fan for that cozy background sound, and let's settle in for the journey ahead. You begin in a grand hall that smells of rosemary candle wax, and the kind of ambition only royalty can afford. The long wooden tables creak under the weight of gold platters, goblets, and food so extravagant it borders on experimental theater. Tonight's competition, roasting the strangest bird imaginable. In one corner, the French king's kitchen staff, dressed in flour-dusted tunics, presenting a roast swan stuffed with songbirds, stuffed with quail eggs, stuffed with grapes. In the other, the English royal cook smugly wheeling in a roast peacock, dressed in its own feathers, with jeweled eyes and a beak painted gold. Inside, a roasted heron. Inside the heron, a partridge. Inside the partridge, sage and plums. Because, obviously. You might think this was a one-off culinary stunt, but medieval cookbooks like the famous Form of Curie record recipes so layered they read like edible nesting dolls. These illusion dishes weren't about taste. They were political power made edible. The roasted peacock wasn't just a bird, it was a statement. An edible flex, an aristocratic mic drop. And then came the jokes. One noble reportedly asked if the swan had voted to be eaten. Another knight speculated that stuffing a bird into another was a metaphor for inheritance law. And someone no one remembers who accidentally swallowed a jeweled toothpick and blamed the peasants. Historically, these feasts were called subtleties, and they were designed to impress and intimidate. Imagine someone serving you a roast goose that upon cutting reveals a working music box made of sugar. Yes, sugar mechanics were a thing, briefly, gloriously, and incredibly impractical. But beyond the absurdity lies the core fact: medieval kings were constantly trying to outdo each other. Not just in war or politics, but in poultry. The weirder the roast, the richer the message. So tonight you trace your fingers along the etched table, feeling the heat from a newly arrived dish, a pastry shaped like a castle. It's smoking. Not from the oven. From dry ice, no. from burning herbs inside a sugar dragon head perched on the crust. This is your dream. You're still lying in bed, but you're also at a banquet where food is diplomacy and roasted birds speak louder than treaties. It makes you wonder who cooked all this. The unsung heroes were guild-trained cooks, sometimes kidnapped from rival courts and sometimes bribed with spices worth more than silver. Their lives were a blur of boiling cauldrons and whispering nobles. In fact, some recipes were state secrets. In 1399, a Venetian ambassador was caught sketching the interior of a royal pie. Not for espionage, for envy. You chuckle, the image flickering behind your eyes. One king once served a pie with live birds inside, so when guests cut in, doves flew out. The dish inspired a nursery rhyme centuries later. But back then it was a fire hazard, a chaotic, feathery, poetic one. And it raises a serious question: were these feasts admired or feared? Some scholars argue that absurd culinary feats alienated commoners. Others claim the spectacle reinforced loyalty through awe. Maybe it was both. Maybe the roasted peacock was both crown and clown. There's even a debate about whether any of this food was actually eaten. Some say the birds were taxidermied and reused. Others suggest the inner layers were cooked, the outer for show. And one theory proposes that much like Instagram food today, it was made to be seen, not consumed. You sigh. You can almost smell the sage. You can hear the clink of goblets. You watch a medieval waiter trip over a lute and spill pomegranate sauce onto a bishop's sleeve. The bishop pretends not to notice, because in these halls nothing, not even a fire-breathing pastry dragon, was stranger than the silence of a displeased monarch. And now you shift slightly under your blanket. You imagine yourself slipping into the corner of that hall unnoticed, cradling a roasted fig stuffed with almond paste. It's warm. It smells like cinnamon and anxiety. You close your eyes, and for a moment you're not in bed. You're in the court of birds, where kings compete in roast-offs and cooks are both artists and pawns. And somewhere in the distance a harpist starts playing a tune you've never heard but already remember. That's enough for tonight. Hey friends, tonight let's explore the strange and smoky world of medieval roasting contests. Yes, tonight is about birds. Big birds. Bizarre birds. Birds that probably shouldn't have been roasted, stuffed, or painted gold, but were anyway. Because if you're a king in the 14th century and you're not flamboyantly roasting something weird, are you even trying? So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And do tell me where and when you're listening. Location and local time always welcome. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself at a royal banquet hall lit by torchlight and oil lamps. The smell hits you first: clove, cinnamon, rosemary, and is that swan? The long tables are groaning with dishes, whole roasted peacocks with their feathers reapplied after cooking. Gold leaf glimmers on the edges of meat pies, wine flows like water. You try not to gape, but really who wouldn't? Across from you sits a young page boy. He leans in and whispers, "Wait till they bring out the phoenix." You raise an eyebrow. He grins. Not a real one, but close enough. Tonight the competition is between King Edward III of England and King Jean VII of France, both eager to outshine one another in culinary spectacle. And nothing says I am the greatest monarch like a golden goose stuffed with almond paste and fireworks. Historical fact: roasting birds whole, sometimes with their plumage reapplied, was a centerpiece of royal feasting culture in medieval Europe. The idea wasn't just to eat, but to impress and intimidate. Quirky detail: there's a 14th century recipe involving sewing the skin of a peacock back onto its cooked body, glazing it with egg yolk, and serving it on fire. The word you're looking for is unnecessary. As you're handed a small trencher of spiced wine and dried fruits, the herald announces the next course, a cockatrice. You blink. Isn't that a mythological monster? Yes, but also no. In this case, it's a chicken sewn onto a suckling pig, roasted together as if to say, "Behold, I control nature and butchery." The cook wearing a crown made of leek leaves presents it proudly. The French ambassador claps politely, hiding a smirk. The English knight beside you mutters, "We once served a pie with live doves inside." Top that. And suddenly you realize this isn't dinner, this is theater. There's music, lutes, and recorders, of course, but it's barely audible over the buzz of gossip. Who's engaged? Who's plotting war? Who imported sugar from Cyprus just for a candied plum centerpiece? Then it happens. A hush falls. A team of servants wheels in an enormous structure, smoke rising from vents along its sides. Is it a roast ox? No. It's larger, more sculpted. It's a roast whale. Okay, fine, it's not a real whale. It's a pig stitched into the shape of one with a tail made from eels and eyes made of boiled eggs. Still, the King of France stands and bows as if he's just slain it himself. And while this sounds ridiculous to you, and it is, there's purpose beneath the absurdity. Roasted birds were often used as displays of wealth control over nature and international reach. The spices alone, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, were worth a fortune. A roast stuffed with cloves wasn't just tasty, it was a political flex. Academic debate scholars still argue whether some of these dishes were meant to be eaten at all. Were they theatrical symbols more than food, or was the performance of eating awkward, messy, excessive part of the ritual? You chewing on something vaguely resembling a pigeon leg aren't sure. The evening drifts on. Someone releases a falcon indoors, why, who knows? It circles the hall once and lands neatly on a roast duck, which is then served with great ceremony. You're handed a slice of pie. Inside is another bird. Yes, it's a pigeon inside a duck inside a goose. Tridactyl poultry pie, someone whispers. You nod solemnly. Around 1,000 words and you begin to lose track of how many birds have passed before you. You've definitely eaten something with a beak. 3 gentle jokes now because you've earned them. What did the medieval cook say to the swan? Don't worry, I'll put your feathers back after. Medieval birds were the original nesting dolls, only greasier. If your dinner needs sewing supplies, maybe it's not dinner anymore. Eventually, the trumpets blare once more. The final roast is revealed, a pie crust shaped like a castle filled with tiny roasted quail and, yes, live sparrows that burst out when it's cut. Gasps, applause. A sparrow lands in your wine. You sip around it politely. As the night winds down, the kings toast each other with candied chicken bones and spiced beer. The page boy leans in again. Tomorrow they're roasting a unicorn. You don't ask. The torch is dim. The smell of smoke and rosemary clings to your cloak. You step outside into cool night air, your belly full of birds you can't name. You never thought roasting could be political, but here among crowned heads and gilded geese you realize to feed is to rule. To roast is to reign. You crouch beside a glowing fire pit, the scent of orange peel and rosewater thick in the evening air. It's not your castle nor your kitchen, and definitely not your peacock roasting on a spit. But here you are anyway, an invited guest at the grand feast of the falconed prince. Somewhere in the northern reaches of France, sometime in the middle of the century, where time is measured by courses and wine refills. And what a course this one is! The server, wearing gloves finer than your old bed sheets, presents the roasted bird. It glistens. It shimmers. It is a peacock, but not any peacock. Its plumage has been reattached after roasting, so it looks as though it was never cooked at all. Its tail fans out in a jewel-toned arc. Gold leaf sparkles on its beak. The whole thing is so absurdly ornate you half expect it to sing a madrigal. You lean in closer. Nope, just smells like cloves and danger. This apparently is what nobles do when they're bored and wealthy. They hold feasting contests. The goal, outdo each other not in taste but in shock value. Roast birds that look alive, pies that scream, fish that spit fire. And now, this peacock. It's more theater than food. And it is theater. There's a lute player narrating the dishes in rhyme. There's a juggler in the corner trying to balance goose eggs. There's a roast swan on the next table shaped like a miniature warship. You wonder how many kitchen boys it takes to glue feathers back on. One noble to your left whispers, "Last year, someone served a hedgehog stuffed with honey and porcupine quills dyed with ink." Another adds, "Once saw a roast unicorn, actually a dyed piglet. The horn was parsnip. The peacock is carved. Its meat is tough, predictably, but you eat anyway for politeness, for curiosity, and for the bragging rights. It's chewy, tastes faintly of nutmeg and the Middle Ages." Historical fact of the night: extravagant food displays like this were part of entremet, a course not meant solely for eating, but for dazzling. These dishes were used to show power, wealth, and status during late medieval and early Renaissance feasts. Some entremets included musical performances, moving mechanical animals, or symbolic storytelling. Quirky aside, at one 15th century banquet, a roast boar's head was made to sneeze spices through a hidden tube. Another had a roast deer sewn back up its body, filled with live birds that burst out mid-meal. Surprise dinner and trauma. And here comes dessert. You're not sure what to expect. A small tower is wheeled out. Its base is pastry, its windows are almond sugar panes, and from its top turret, a marzipan knight with licorice armor waves a jelly bean flag. It's edible. It's also deeply unsettling. You take a bite, sweet, chewy. Your molars briefly regret their loyalty. A nearby lady says, "I hear the Spanish court made a sugar dragon that breathed cinnamon." You reply, "Next time I'm bringing a potato." Boiled, as a political statement. She laughs. Maybe. Or maybe she just chokes on a candied beet. The wine keeps flowing. You lose track of the courses. You're not sure if the boar-shaped cake was real or not. Someone swears the fish just blinked. Debate of the evening. Were these dishes really meant to be eaten? Or were they edible sculptures, ephemeral art? Some historians argue that entremets were a way for courts to flex. Others suggest they carried moral symbolism: birds returning to life, beasts taming fire, humans mastering nature. Or maybe it was just a very long, very medieval version of "my dinner is better than yours." You don't have the answer, but you do have indigestion. You slip away from the table, past a roast crane covered in sugared violets, and into the cooler hallway. Your ears ring from the bagpipes. Your tongue tingles from saffron. A kitchen boy races past with what appears to be a tiny chariot made of cheese. You whisper to yourself, "Maybe tomorrow I'll just have some bread." But you know you won't, not when you've tasted theater. You return to your room, well, a borrowed room. There's a tapestry of St. George slaying a dragon. The dragon appears mildly amused. You lie down, close your eyes, and for a moment you swear you hear the marzipan knight galloping across your sugar plum dreams. Hey friends, tonight let's explore one of the more confusing but gloriously dramatic events in medieval feast history: the Battle of the Bards at the Feast of the Five Kingdoms. Yes, you heard that right. A roast bird feast with competitive poetry. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And hey, drop your location and time zone in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a giant hall carved into the rock of a hill, real cold stone. The floor is covered in rushes, but they've been mixed with crushed bay leaves to hide the scent of too many boots and too few baths. In the center of the hall is a long table that looks like it was built for giants over 40 feet of solid oak. And along this table, roast birds, every kind. Some recognizable goose, duck, pheasant, some less so, swan, crane, even the occasional peacock that still has its feathers. Those were sewn back on after roasting. Yes, really. Tonight isn't just about eating. It's about showing off. Because 5 kingdoms have come together and each has brought their best poet, bard, or singer to accompany the unveiling of their signature bird. You don't just taste the dish, you get serenaded by an ode to its preparation. That's how you end up with lines like, "O duck, thou tender flame-born star. Thy skin like sunlit parchment lies ajar." That one caused 2 bishops to faint. They said it was the meter. It wasn't. The bards stand at podiums. The audience, mostly nobles, drinks mulled wine and judges silently. Occasionally, a roasted songbird is passed down on a plate of gold. No one eats it. They just stare at it respectfully as if it might start to sing again. One bard, a woman from the Hill Kingdom, uses no words. She whistles a tune while holding up an herbed quail and then smashes it gently with a silver spoon. Everyone claps. No one understands why. Meanwhile, the rival bard from the Riverlands recites a sonnet that rhymes gizzards with wizards. Mixed reviews. And the swannet comes out carried by 4 men, its wings carefully lifted and scented with orange peel and rosewater. A lute player sings a dirge. One child cries. A knight drops his fork in awe. Let's pause here for our historical fact of the evening. Common fact, medieval banquets often featured not just food, but full theatrical displays, meat shaped into castles, pies that released birds or frogs, and even edible sculptures painted with gold leaf. They were part food, part performance art, and quirky detail. In one recorded French feast, a cooked peacock was redressed in its feathers and presented on a silver horse-drawn cart while trumpeters played fanfares in its honor. Open-ended debate. Did these feasts genuinely impress, or did they often verge into absurdity? Some scholars argue they reflected sacred symbolism. Others say they were elaborate ways to distract from food shortages or bad governance. Back in the hall, the judging begins. It's tense. One bard throws shade literally by tilting the candelabrum just so that their rival is bathed in flickering shadows. Another simply pulls out a roasted partridge and begins to juggle. No one expected that. Even fewer understood why he did it shirtless. By the end of the night, no clear winner is declared. That's part of the charm. Everyone drinks enough spiced mead to forget who they voted for, and the swan is mysteriously missing half its feathers again. And you're still there. In the quiet glow of flickering torches, watching the final crumbs of hazelnut stuffing being licked off silver daggers. You don't know who won the poetry battle, but you do know this medieval people loved to roast a bird and make it weird. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of chaos we could all use a little more of. That's tonight's roast. Tonight the hall is filled with smoke, not the soft, pleasant kind curling from herbs or roasted meat, but the dramatic eyebrow-singeing kind that comes from trying to roast a peacock while it's still wearing its feathers. And yes, that really happened. Welcome to the wild theater of medieval feast politics. You're seated low on a creaky bench watching servants scramble across the flagstones while an unfortunate cook, eyes watering and hair singed, lifts the lid off something that should not still be squawking. This is not merely dinner. It is display competition theater and sometimes chaos. So hi all, tonight we'll discover why medieval kings competed over who could roast the weirdest bird. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is by your candle or clock. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval banquet wasn't just about feeding people. It was about feeding reputations. Especially among kings and nobles, the banquet was a high-stakes social arena where influence was roasted and reputation carved like a roast boar. Let's start with a common bird made uncommonly strange, the peacock. In the late Middle Ages, particularly in France and England, peacocks weren't just admired, they were flamboyantly cooked, redressed in their own feathers and served in a pose as if still alive. It was a show of wealth and control over nature. But the joke among many was that despite the pageantry, peacock meat was legendarily tough. One chronicler wrote that it was like chewing parchment. Soaked in regret. So why serve it? Well, because no one forgot the guy who served it. Especially if the peacock was made to breathe fire, which some cooks did using alcohol and carefully timed lighting. Yes, flaming poultry, a culinary stunt. Now, if you thought that was extreme, imagine a cockatrice. No, not an insult, but a Frankenstein dish where the front half of a piglet was sewn to the back half of a capon, a castrated rooster, or sometimes even the other way around. It was then roasted whole and presented as a mythical beast. Bonus points if the wings were gold-leafed. This wasn't just for fun. These hybrid dishes symbolized control over the natural world, the ingenuity of a household, and the deep pockets it required to waste food in the name of entertainment. Which brings us to our historical fact of the night. King Henry VIII once threw a banquet where over 200 exotic dishes were served, including dolphins and porpoises. Not exactly dolphin-safe dining, but here's the twist: many guests didn't actually eat much. The food you see was often a form of visual spectacle rather than sustenance. People would nibble, politely admire, and then focus on who was seated where, who toasted whom, and how many jesters had been hired. Your weird detail of the night. In some French courts, swan meat was boiled in wine covered in saffron and refeathered before presentation. The dish was called swan en herbe, and often accompanied by a poem recited by a child dressed as a knight. It's medieval dinner theater meets avant-garde performance art. You shift on your bench again, listening to the clatter of platters being cleared and smell the sharp tang of clove and orange peel. Spices weren't just for flavor, they were for status. Importing cinnamon or mace from the East showed you had both connections and coin. So when King Richard II's kitchens were said to use over 1,000 pounds of ginger a year, that was a diplomatic flex. Academic debate time. Did these displays genuinely reflect culinary innovation, or were they politically motivated stagecraft meant to distract from domestic instability? Some argue that these meals served as edible propaganda demonstrating abundance in times of hardship. Others believe it was a culinary arms race, pure and simple, with each lord trying to outdo the other. And that arms race could get weird. Records from a German noble's banquet include a pie that, when opened, released a live band of birds. Think of it like a living music box. Of course, not all birds cooperated. Some flew into chandeliers. Some relieved themselves in soup. Pause here and imagine the smell of roasted goose laced with lavender honey. Rich, smoky, sticky. The medieval palate adored sweet-sour combinations. Vinegar, sugar, dried fruits. Even meatballs came with raisins. Because nothing says decadence like meat with jam. You chuckle to yourself as the band starts playing a lute and flute number that sounds vaguely like a goat tap dancing. Somewhere behind you, a jester drops a tray of eel pies and a dog makes off with one. Now let's talk dessert. Sugar, still rare and costly, was used to sculpt entire edible scenes. A sugar castle, a sugar knight fighting a sugar dragon. And then, dramatic pause, the dragon would bleed red wine when pierced. If you're imagining Game of Thrones meets the Great British Bake Off, you're not far off. But not everything was edible. Some banquets used painted wood mock-ups to create illusionary abundance. A leg of lamb made of pastry shell, a fish carved from marzipan. The illusion was part of the show. Real food optional. Another favorite, gilded food. That's right, chefs applied gold leaf to roast chickens, apples, even loaves of bread. Eating gold didn't add flavor. It added clout. You yawn slightly, the feast goes on. You're still full from the invisible pheasant. Tonight's been ridiculous, hasn't it, but also revealing. Because beneath all the culinary chaos lay something deeply human. A desire to be seen, remembered, admired. Whether through a flaming swan or a sugar sculpture of St. George, medieval nobles used food to speak loudly, even when the politics of the day required silence. So tonight, if you dream of a peacock giving you side-eye from across a banquet table or a goose wearing a crown, don't be alarmed. Just nod, tip your hat, and pass the saffron sauce. Hey friends, tonight let's explore a banquet hall that smells like rosemary smoke and just a hint of swan feathers. Yes, swans. Because in this part of the tale, your feet step lightly across stone floors into a royal kitchen that could cook an entire bestiary. You've heard of feasts before, but tonight we focus on what happens after the meats are roasted on the sauces. Thick, glossy, suspiciously colorful sauces. They glisten in gold bowls poured in dramatic ribbons over cuts of venison, boar, and goose. Some are sweet, others sharply sour, many hiding pungent herbal twists. And while they may look like gravy's distant flamboyant cousin, these sauces were the crown jewels of medieval cuisine. So why all this sauce fuss? Here's your first historical fact. Sauces weren't just about taste, they were about showing off. Spices like cinnamon, ginger grains of paradise, and saffron didn't just cost a fortune. They were a fortune. Being able to serve a dish with imported pepper and a wine reduction could whisper louder than a crown. And then there's the bread. Oh, the poor trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up every drop of meaty opulence. They weren't for eating, not usually. Instead, they were meant to absorb the flavor and be gifted to the poor afterward. Imagine the social messaging, I am so powerful, my waist is gourmet. Your hands hover over an array of color-coded sauces like paint for meat. A vivid green made of parsley and mint. A deep yellow thickened with egg yolk and saffron. A red so intense it might be beetroot or blood. You sniff one that smells suspiciously like fish and honey. Indeed. One of the strangest side notes of medieval saucing was the love of combining fish-based stock with sweeteners. In Lent, it got even stranger: fish sauce thickened with almond milk and scented with rose water. The church demanded abstinence from meat, but nobody said anything about flavor acrobatics. Let's take a pause here for some mental silliness. Medieval chefs walked so modern mixologists could run. If you think pineapple on pizza is controversial, wait until you try anchovy almond cinnamon sauce. Somewhere a medieval cook is still offended that we call ketchup fancy. Now here's the quirky detail of this chapter. There were recipe books just for sauces. Entire manuscripts dedicated to sauce sarkiness, Saracen sauce, vert sauce, green sauce, and galantine, a thick sauce that could moonlight as wallpaper paste. These weren't casual kitchen notes. They were part culinary guide, part coded language of status and diplomacy. Some sauces were only for high-ranking guests. Others marked regions' allegiances or even feast themes. One banquet menu from Burgundy listed over 30 sauces. That's more than most modern households have condiments. And here's your open-ended academic debate: were medieval sauces primarily about preserving meat, flavoring poor cuts, or flexing status, or perhaps all three? It's tempting to romanticize the complexity as culinary genius. But some historians argue it was more about hiding spoilage. After all, no refrigerators. Still, as you dip a ladle into a bubbling pot of clove-scented wine reduction, you feel the joy of it. The playfulness, the audacity. The kitchen clinks with copper and ceramic. Someone fans a coal bed while chanting a psalm under their breath. A boy crushes herbs with a marble pestle, looking proud as the paste begins to shine. You take a bit of meat, hypothetical meat of course, and drizzle a green sauce over it. It hits your tongue like spring, then warmth, then a whisper of bitterness. A finish like garden walls in late April. You're not sure if it's good exactly, but it's alive. Tonight you learn that sauces weren't a side act. They were the stage, the drama, the magic trick. Even when the meat is plain, the sauce turns it into a story. And as you step back from the hearth, fingers sticky with syrup and vinegar, you wonder what today's condiments will say about us centuries from now. Maybe that's the real sauce legacy: flavor as fingerprint. The banquet hall smells like roast swan and regret. You're seated somewhere in the middle of a long oak table that groans beneath the weight of gilded trenchers, salt cellars carved like unicorns, and one unfortunate badger stuffed, glazed, and crowned with parsley. The flicker of candlelight bounces off armor jewels and gravy. Tonight's noble feast has taken a turn. It began, as it often does, with the king trying to impress the foreign envoy. He ordered the cooks to create a bird no one would forget. What emerged from the kitchen was part peacock, part pheasant sewn together at the spine feathers replaced with dyed silk and its eyes replaced with tiny sapphires. You're not sure whether to applaud or ask for absolution. This is called a subtlety or subtlety, a medieval food illusion more magic than meal. These weren't just about taste, they were edible theater. In fact, medieval royal banquets often featured elaborately constructed dishes known as subtleties, which were designed to surprise, impress, or convey political messages. The performance continues. A roasted boar's head is paraded through the hall with trumpets. It's stuffed with oranges and apples, but also because someone read too much Ovid grapes stuffed inside the mouth of a taxidermied raven. A monk at the corner of the hall visibly recoils, but you chew quietly, because you know where this is going. You've seen this show before. Soon the nobles will compete, not with words or swords, but with poultry. Lord Hugh raises a hand. Bring in the goose stuffed with frogs. Lady Marjorie counters, nay, bring the eel that sings it does not. A culinary arms race is underway. With each dish, a cook's pride and a noble's ego are on the line. Odd detail. One documented feast included a roast peacock served in its full plumage, the neck propped to appear alive. The meat was often dry, but that didn't matter. It was a symbol of power and spectacle. And then comes the goose, not a regular goose. This one has been roasted, painted with saffron and gold leaf, and somehow reconstructed to look like a phoenix. When it's placed before the king, someone sets off a firecracker inside the platter. Sparks shoot out. The king applauds. You drop your spoon. This is the kind of dining that makes you question your career choices. The fire dies down, but the conversation rises. Lord Robert mentions the Great Chicken War of Montfort, where two rival kitchens tried to one-up each other by layering partridges inside pigeons, inside rabbits, inside ducks. The result, he claims, was a triumph of protein. A jester overhears and snorts, a triumph of indigestion, more like. You laugh into your wine. Scholarly question. Were these subtleties primarily about aesthetics and entertainment? Or did they serve a deeper socio-political role in reinforcing hierarchy and displaying wealth? Across the table, someone pulls back the lid on a pie crust. It moves. Yes, it moves. A live bird flutters out, a lark, confused and furious. It flies toward the ceiling, sending guests diving under tables. It's an old trick, but it always gets a reaction. The king beams. A feast for all the senses. You whisper, especially fear. Later that night, as the hall empties and only crumbs and candle wax remain, you wander back toward the kitchen. The cooks sit with their sleeves rolled up, drinking spiced wine and rubbing sore hands. They've created art. Dangerous, ridiculous, fleeting art. And you survived the roast phoenix and the pie that chirped. That's a good day. Tomorrow, they say, someone's planning to sculpt a dragon out of marzipan and smoked trout. But for now, you settle into your bed of straw and dreams. Let the goose fly. Hey friends, tonight let's explore something bold, buttery, and just a bit bizarre, because this part of the story is all about medieval golden birds. Not mythical, mind you. Real birds, covered in gold leaf, served on platters. And no, you don't get to keep the feathers. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And let me know in the comments what time it is, where you're listening from, and where you're tuning in. I'm always curious who else is wandering history at this hour. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The banquet hall is dim, lit by torches and reflections off goblets taller than your hand. You watch as the servant glides past, his arms stretched like a tightrope walker, balancing a silver platter that seems to hum with heat. The guests hush. A goose appears, except it glitters, like a cursed statue from a fairy tale. Because it is gilded. Medieval chefs in noble courts, especially in places like France, Burgundy, and England, were not just cooks. They were performers. You're watching dinner theater with the duck playing the lead role in its costume gold leaf. Applied carefully over roasted skin, pure extravagance, and completely inedible. But was the point ever to eat it? Not really. It was about seeing it. You were supposed to gasp, maybe even clap. A golden bird says we have money, we have art, and yes, we're absurd. You might be wondering, was it safe? Probably not. But who's asking that when the king is giggling like a child and the bishop is trying to paint it in his notebook? This wasn't a one-time event. There are records of feasts where multiple birds were gilded swans, peacocks, even small birds perched dramatically on sugar branches. The skin was sometimes painted with saffron to add warmth, then dusted with gold leaf while still warm so it adhered better. And yes, someone had to apply all that. Gilding assistants existed in kitchens. Some were artists, some were apprentices who didn't ask questions. And at least one must have whispered, "This can't possibly be edible," and then kept brushing. Here's your historical fact in the court of Burgundy in the 15th century. The chef Taillevent included specific instructions for presenting a peacock with its skin resewn over the cooked flesh tail feathers spread and gilded. A phoenix reborn on a plate, the quirky side detail. Some birds were served breathing smoke. You'd insert a tiny metal pipe into the roasted chest cavity, light a fragrant herb like rosemary inside, and puff out came an aromatic mist. It was illusion cuisine, medieval molecular gastronomy minus the lab coats. And now for our scholarly curiosity. Did diners actually want to eat such creations? Or were these feasts meant to signal social hierarchy more than satisfy appetite? Were people eating or simply performing? You lean back. The smell of roast duck, burnt rosemary, and warm metal lingers in the air. A lute plucks softly. Somewhere a noble complains that last year's bird was shinier. You watch as a child sneaks a bite of gold-laced skin chews slowly and grins. "Tastes like candle," she says. You don't laugh, you nod. That's about right. 3 light jokes as promised. Medieval cooks had no chill. Literally everything was either boiled, roasted, or flamboyantly on fire. The only thing more gilded than the bird was probably the cook's ego. And yes, if you're wondering, there was almost certainly someone who bit into a golden goose and broke a tooth. We honor them here. You settle into the moment. The fire's crackle blends with the soft clatter of pewter. You imagine the feast continues, new dishes parading in stranger each time. You smile. Tonight you've learned that even in history, humans couldn't resist showing off, especially when dinner was involved. Tonight we step into the grandest kitchens of medieval Europe, vaulted stone rooms where fire is currency, spices are wealth, and every roasted bird is a declaration of power. The kind of kitchen where even the smoke has secrets. And tonight's story is about the one thing that brought all this heat together, not war, not politics, but the outrageous, glorious competition to roast the weirdest bird. Yes, you heard that right. Kings didn't just want food, they wanted culinary spectacle. And sometimes that meant presenting a dinner guest with a swan that had been plucked, roasted, then redressed in its original feathers, neck arched proudly, wings outstretched like a phoenix in denial. Tonight you're standing in one of those kitchens. The fire pops. The scent of cloves and smoke clings to your sleeves, and something under that velvet dome on the silver tray is definitely blinking at you. But we'll get to that in a moment. One popular medieval custom among royalty was the entremets, a kind of theatrical food performance inserted between banquet courses. The purpose to impress, dazzle, confuse, and of course outroast your rivals. For example, the court of Burgundy once presented a roast peacock with a small functioning organ hidden inside, playing a tune as the meat cooled. In another, a knight rode into the dining hall on a full-sized roasted boar with armor, carrying a flag that announced the next course. Some chefs were instructed to prepare pies with live birds sealed inside. The moment the crust was broken, sparrows would erupt into the air above the table. Surprise! One banquet in France boasted a roasted bear. whose paws had been replaced with gilded marzipan claws. And perhaps most bewildering, a Hungarian noble was said to have hosted a feast where each guest received a different part of a mythical creature. A griffin wing, a basilisk tail, a phoenix breast, all made of goose chicken and artistic lies. Let's pause for a moment. You reach for a goblet. It's gold but heavy as if filled with guilt. The roast in front of you, an animal with too many legs, smells faintly of rosemary and theater. You're not just at a meal. You're at a performance. One where the script is written in gravy and the applause is given by belching. Historically, these performances weren't just for fun. They were tools of political theater. If your feast was bigger, stranger, and more delicious than your rivals, it proved your power, your wealth, and your ability to control the unnatural. Even colors mattered. Food dyed green with parsley or spinach implied freshness and spring. Dishes dyed blue rare and expensive implied divinity and mystery. One English king was so obsessed with the color symbolism of his roasts that he demanded a different shade for each bird: purple pigeons, golden pheasants, red swans. Which sounds absurd, but not as absurd as the fact that some of these birds were dyed while still alive, paraded around, and then, well, you can guess the rest. And here comes the historical fact. For tonight, roasted peacocks were one of the most prestigious dishes in medieval banquets, often redressed in their iridescent feathers and served whole on elaborate stands. The skin was carefully removed before roasting. The bird was cooked, and then the skin with feathers was sewn or glued back on, sometimes even with jewels added. Why? Because presentation mattered more than practicality. And because nothing says I control nature like flambeing a bird and then pretending it's still alive. And now for the quirky aside. One record from a 15th century German noble household included a chef's receipt for a mock roasted dragon made of a calf's body, goose wings, a pig's snout, and a tail of braided dough. It was reportedly too realistic, and several guests refused to eat anything after its arrival. There is no surviving record of what happened to the dragon, but let's assume it retired peacefully. And here's your scholarly debate. Some historians argue these extravagant entremets were a way to distract guests from the limited variety or questionable freshness of food available, especially in winter months. Others believe they served deeper psychological and religious roles, symbolizing mastery over creation, echoing biblical themes of divine banquets and beasts. Is it more about power or more about poetry? Maybe both. You're chewing on more than roasted fantasy here. The fire crackles behind you. A jester balances on a wine barrel, reciting a menu as if it's a love letter. You sip something sweet and cinnamon spiced. It warms your teeth. And then it arrives, the final dish. It's covered in a cloth embroidered with gold thread. A monk in a chef's hat walks in backwards. Two trumpeters play a fanfare that sounds suspiciously like a chicken cluck. The cloth is lifted. It's a rooster, wearing a tiny crown, and it winks. You may not remember the exact birds or the flavors, but you'll remember the feeling of being outmatched by dinner, of realizing that sometimes history isn't about who ruled what or which war ended where. Sometimes it's about who looked at a duck and said, let's give it antlers, and who had the budget to make it happen. That's medieval cuisine for you. Absurd, glorious, and just weird enough to follow you into your dreams. Now close your eyes. Let the warmth of the oven lull you. And if you hear flapping in the night, it's probably just a pastry swan making one last lap around your imagination. You wake to the scent of roasted rosemary and something odd. Not burnt, not quite spoiled, just strange enough to make you curious. And that's how we begin tonight, your feet already padded quietly into the great medieval banquet hall where kings once competed over who could roast the weirdest bird. Yes, weird. Not grandest, not juiciest, but weirdest. Welcome to the age of culinary one-upmanship, where peacocks wore their own feathers back to the table and swans were paraded in with golden crowns. Tonight we descend into the delicious absurdity of competitive medieval roasting. You settle near the fire pit, and the first thing that greets you is the medieval classic, the peacock. Not just cooked, no, that would be boring. This one is flambéed, redressed in its original feathers after roasting and dusted with real gold leaf. A peacock reborn like a culinary phoenix. Is it edible? Barely, but is it memorable? Oh yes. You're not here to eat, though. You're here to marvel like the court did centuries ago, to witness what happens when food becomes theater. A roasted heron appears next, served upright as if still alive. It's stuffed with spices so aromatic that your eyes water and you're not even chewing. The medieval noble's feast wasn't about sustenance, it was about pageantry. Food was performance politics and power on a silver platter. Imagine if your dinner plate arrived mid-symphony wrapped in fur and reciting poetry. That's the vibe. And then just as you think it can't get weirder, the cockatrice waddles in. A mythical Frankenstein's bird. Half piglet, half rooster, sewn together and roasted whole. It's meant to symbolize control over nature. You whisper to yourself, or maybe just control over boredom. You spot a young kitchen boy bringing in a dish that looks like a hedgehog. It's actually a meatball carefully sculpted with almond spines. There's no limit to imagination here, only to taste sometimes. Your historical fact. By the 14th century, chefs in royal kitchens were often artists, performers, and engineers. Their job was to surprise, not just to nourish, a side detail. Some of these roast hybrids were inedible. They were paraded and replaced before the actual meal. A stunt, the culinary version of a magician's flourish. A scholarly debate. Were these elaborate dishes displays of wealth or coded political theater meant to intimidate guests and allies alike? You sit back and imagine the kitchen a furnace of chaos. Dozens of servants flipping birds, dressing up pies, assembling boar heads with glass eyes. Everything timed to perfection, not for flavor but applause. At the corner of the banquet, a roasted crane is stuffed with spices and sewn shut with silver thread. It is served whole next to a bowl of saffron sauce so yellow it glows. Some guests only dip bread, some just gawk. You pause to take in the mood torchlight flickering against silk banners, minstrels tuning lutes, and guests whispering behind goblets. They're not whispering secrets, they're guessing what's next. A plate arrives that looks like a castle. It is. Made of meat and sugar paste. The drawbridge opens to reveal roasted larks inside. The lords applaud. The ladies sip rosewater. You laugh gently, imagining a modern dinner guest pulling this off. And for the main course, turkey stuffed with squirrel and garnished with candied antlers. The jokes come easy now. Sir Thomas, your duck is on fire. It's supposed to be, it's a phoenix. I asked for rare, not resurrected. You lean against a velvet cushion full not from food, but from spectacle. This was dining as declaration. The king saying, I control nature. I control time. I control how a goose becomes a griffin. Outside, a gentle breeze carries the scent of pine and pepper. You wonder what poor kitchen hand had to sew the rooster to the pig. Did they giggle? Did they cry? Did they dream of simpler meals? Now the flames die down and the last roast is wheeled in an ordinary capon, perfectly seasoned, no tricks. The hall goes quiet, not from boredom, from awe. Sometimes the boldest move is restraint. And so tonight, as you drift to sleep, you remember not just the pageantry, but the hands behind it. The labor, the heat, the absurd genius of turning dinner into drama. If your dreams take you to a place where birds wear masks and pies sing lullabies, follow them. You've earned a little culinary madness. Hello everyone, tonight we're going to sink our teeth into something both royal and ridiculous, how medieval kings competed to outdo each other with the most bizarre roasted birds you've never heard of. And yes, we're talking peacocks, swans, and the occasional porcupine. Don't ask just yet. So before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time your clock says. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit at the far end of a long oak table. Before you, rows of brass candlesticks flicker like soldiers keeping guard. The air is thick with the scent of bay leaves, ginger, and roasting flesh. To your left, a bishop whispers a prayer over his mead. To your right, a knight in crusted armor counts the number of birds he's already seen wheeled in tonight. It's a feast, but not just any feast, it's a banquet war. You're attending the famed contest between two 14th century monarchs who, unsatisfied with merely ruling, decided to settle territorial disputes with roasted bird exhibitions. Each course is an escalation. First came pheasants roasted with their feathers flamboyantly glued back on tails, flaring like parade fans. Then geese turned into fake dragons. Yes, one cook reportedly used green batter, saffron sauce, and almond horns to make a roast goose look like a lizard with gout. But the jewel in the poultry crown, a peacock, not just roasted but reassembled. The poor bird was gutted, skewered, stuffed with spices and gilded almonds, then sewn back into its own skin and feathers. Its beak gilded, its claws perched on a stand of silver. When served, the king's herald announced, "Behold the bird who sings no more, yet glitters still with royal pride." You sip your warm wine and try not to think about how long it took to glue every feather back on. Historical fact. In the late medieval period, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries, banquets were stages of political performance as much as culinary indulgence. Dishes like cockatrice, a stitched-together piglet, and rooster and gilded peacocks were not only food but power symbols. Quirky detail. Some of these birds weren't eaten. They were just for show. By the time the 5th or 6th course appeared, nobles were too full or too drunk to bother with more than a bite. But the birds kept coming. Culinary theater was the real dish of the evening. Scholarly question. Did these feasts serve to unify or intimidate the attending nobles? Was the over-the-top poultry pageantry a form of cultural cohesion or subtle warfare by roast? The kitchen, meanwhile, is bedlam. A teenage cook's apprentice is sobbing over a swan that refuses to brown evenly. A master cook sharpens his knife against the back of a copper ladle. Boiling pans hiss like angry serpents. "Where's the hedgehog?" someone shouts. You hope it's a pie name and not an actual hedgehog. Tonight's menu boasts mock porcupine, which turns out to be minced veal molded into a ball crusted with almonds for quills. A delicacy, if you enjoy eating what looks like a weaponized meatball. And the sauces, there are at least 12. You taste one made of wine, vinegar, raisins, mustard, and something that reminds you faintly of burnt onions and betrayal. By dessert, no one knows what's food and what's performance art. You witness a sugar castle collapse under the weight of a marzipan knight. People cheer. You don't ask why. Someone hands you a singing bird pie. It doesn't sing, but the crust is flaky. You step out into the night air, your robe dusted with crumbs and a small almond lodged in your sleeve. The stars above you twinkle like the sequins of a roasted pigeon's plumage. You think of all the birds who've unwillingly participated in this theater of egos, and yet there's something oddly touching in it. The way humans use food to impress, intimidate, and connect. The absurdity, the devotion, the glittered peacock who gave its feathers one last encore. And the cook's apprentice eyes, red but proud, watching from the corner as his swan finally turned golden. You lie back in your imagination's long grass full of roasted oddities and soft speculation. The night hums. The question remains, did the king settle their argument? No. But the guests left full. And someone's still talking about that hedgehog. You're not sure when it became a competition. Maybe it was always one. The banquets, the peacocks, the roasts wrapped in other roasts. The roasted fish with eyes made of pearls and mouths stuffed with songbirds. Somewhere between one king trying to outfeast another and a duke serving pastry crusts shaped like his enemies, things got a little out of hand. Tonight you're at the edge of a great hall. The candles are melting in waves. The fire is tall, orange, angry. and near it, suspended on a spit the length of a ship's mast, is something that used to be a bird, or several birds, maybe also a deer. Possibly something mythical, the cooks won't say. All you know is this: it spins, it hisses, it smells like 10 feasts fighting, and this is only the third course. Welcome to the strange world of medieval food competitions where nobility didn't just eat to survive or impress, they ate to dominate. It started with a common historical fact, that medieval banquets were sites of status display and food was as much about spectacle as it was about taste. A peacock might be skinned roasted and then redressed in its own feathered coat. A swan might be roasted gilded in gold leaf and served with a poem describing its tragic nobility. But here's the quirky bit: there were unwritten rules. Like never serving the same roasted beast twice in 1 month, or ensuring your fish dish still looked like it could swim away. One record even mentions a feast where live frogs were hidden inside pies, leaping out mid-meal to the audience's delighted horror. Imagine being the guest who screams the loudest and gets grape juice up the nose. Not very dignified, but very memorable. These feasts weren't always joyful. Sometimes they were strategic. If a rival kingdom's delegation was visiting your roasted spectacle, better say, "We have money, we have flair, and we can gild a goose without blinking." Which brings us to our central question: were these food displays genuinely appreciated? Or were they silently mocked by the guests? Because not all noble stomachs were thrilled. Many complained in private diaries that the food was overspiced, lukewarm, or too elaborately arranged to eat. One noble grumbled that his beef was so carved into roses he couldn't tell meat from table decoration. Still, the pressure to impress drove innovation. New roasting techniques, sugar sculpture mastery, even puppet-like automaton pies with dancing figurines became the rage. In France, one noble hosted a banquet where each course was rolled out on tiny boats floating across a shallow indoor moat. The wine was poured from ceramic dragons, the napkins swan-shaped, and the roast boar stuffed with 40 larks, each stuffed with a cherry. After 1,000 words, let's breathe. Here are 3 light bites to savor. One English duke in the 14th century roasted a whale tail just to prove he could get it inland. It reportedly took 17 horses and one very stubborn priest to bless it. Roasted hedgehog was considered a delicacy in some courts, especially if it was covered in almond paste and dyed pink. One monk wrote, half scandalized, that a nobleman once served an eel sewn inside a capon, sewn inside a goose, sewn inside a pig. The monk called it culinary heresy. Now back to the glow of that banquet fire. Your feet are warm. Your hands smell faintly of rosemary. The music has shifted low lute strums and a wind instrument shaped like a crane's neck. Someone is announcing the next course. From behind a curtain, a roasted goose emerges. It wears a tiny crown. Its wings have been stitched to form a prayer gesture. And in its beak, a ribbon reading, "Long live the taste of power." You don't laugh. No one does. That's part of the game. Tonight, you're not just eating. You're surviving a battle of edible pride. And strangely, you wouldn't have it any other way. Tonight, you find yourself beneath a massive canopy of embroidered banners fluttering gently above a long, groaning table. Gold goblets shimmer in the torchlight. Roasted beasts lie in theatrical poses wearing fruit garlands and cloves like jewels. And in the center, a dish that shouldn't exist, a roast swan wearing a faux deer's head, its wings lacquered into a fan, its beak stuffed with berries. Because tonight we step into the wildest banquets of medieval kings, where food was no longer just food. It was theater. It was challenge. It was at times an edible hallucination of power. Your seat is velvet. Your spoon carved ivory. Your napkin is embroidered with gold thread. And yet the moment you look down at your plate, you're torn between awe and gentle horror. A pie just blinked at you. Let's talk about subtleties. Subtleties were elaborate sculptures of sugar dough or meat designed to entertain and confuse. They came shaped like castle saints or mythical creatures, often with moving part sound effects or live animals inside. Yes, live, that blinking pie. It might have a pigeon in it. Imagine your host grinning as the lid is lifted and birds fly out trailing ribbons. Laughter erupts. Nobles clap. And someone whispers he did better than last year's fish night duel. You're not hallucinating, this is dinner as pageantry, and the stakes are surprisingly high. Common fact, medieval royal feasts often included extravagant food illusions known as subtleties, which were meant to showcase power, wealth, and the host's sense of spectacle. Quirky detail. Some dishes were rigged to speak by using bladders filled with air and reeds so a pie could croak like a frog or a boar could snort on cue. Scholarly question. Were subtleties more about impressing guests or distracting them from deeper court politics? Meanwhile, the kitchen, oh, the kitchen. You think your oven gets hot? Try roasting a full stag over an open flame while 10 pages baste it with honey wine. Cooks run like battlefield commanders, barking orders, juggling timelines. There's a rotating roast of peacock with its feathers reattached post-cooking for flair. A jelly tower made to collapse at the perfect moment. And somewhere a trembling assistant is trying to balance a pie filled with frogs and dancing sugar figurines. You bite into your roast goose. It's been basted in rose water and sage, then dusted with crushed almonds. Sweet, salty, fragrant, slightly alarming. Then the next course arrives, a dish called Hell's Garden. You're told it's a commentary on sin and temptation. What it actually is, a field of dough shaped like trees, tiny sugar snakes, and a roasted eel coiled around a candied apple. The symbolism is heavy-handed, but the sugar snake is surprisingly good. Somewhere down the table, a guest pokes a roasted hedgehog with a knife. It squeaks. Everyone applauds. You glance to your left. A noble is casually describing how his chef once created a dragon made from venison and swan breathing steam through concealed reeds. It won me Flanders, he says, sipping wine. Is he joking? You're not sure. At the far end, the king leans forward. His voice is soft, but it carries. Bring in the surprise. You watch as a towering dessert is wheeled in, shaped like a castle made of sugar and almond paste. One turret suddenly opens. Out walks a trained monkey dressed as a knight holding a custard tart. And that's when you realize you're not at a banquet. You're inside a performance, a soft war of opulence. Behind every roast chimera, every blinking pie, every sugar chariot, there's a silent message. Look what I can make. Look what I can control. Look how much I can waste. Excess is language, and dinner is the dialect. At one banquet in 1429, it was said the Duke of Burgundy served roast whale gold-dusted pears, and a giant pie from which a dwarf popped out and recited a poem. The audience clapped. The dwarf bowed. Then dessert was served. This might seem strange to you, absurd even, but think of how we use food today. Cake toppers, sparkler candles, gender reveal cupcakes, edible glitter. Now crank that up to medieval monarchy. You reach for a piece of heavenly pork wrapped in gilded dough filled with prunes and cinnamon. It tastes like winter trying to seduce a storm. And then the wine hits you, not because of the alcohol, but because it's blue. You ask the servant. Crushed violets, they whisper, and a little other thing. No one ever tells you what the other thing is. This entire evening feels like a fever dream produced by pastry chefs with theology degrees. And maybe that's the point. Feasts like this weren't for daily nourishment. They were for display, for memory, for gossip, for reminding everyone who was in charge. Did you hear what the Viscount served last month? He had a stuffed heron that spat confetti. Well, wait until you see what the Queen's pastry mage has prepared. Yes, pastry mage. That's not official, but you suspect it was whispered behind flowery curtains. But here's the other truth. Not everyone was amused. Some monks wrote sermons about wasteful feasting. Some nobles criticized the expense. Even the clergy would groan before asking for seconds. In fact, one bishop reportedly banned laughing pies from a Lenten banquet after a terrified squire ran from the room convinced the pastry was possessed. You finish your plate. The lights dim. A harpist begins to play. The monkey has been given a biscuit and a tiny trumpet. Somewhere behind you, a pie begins to hum. And you lean back, belly full, eyes dazzled, brain gently questioning reality. You've survived another royal banquet, but just wait until breakfast. Hey friends, tonight let's explore something a little less noble and a bit more crispy. You are walking slowly through a corridor in a castle that smells of damp stone oak polish and oddly enough fried batter. The walls echo with nothing but your own soft steps and the ghost of distant laughter. This was once a place of great feasts, and tonight it still is just not the kind you'd expect. Because tonight we're talking about medieval fritters. Yes, fritters. Golden, bubbling, frequently questionable. Sometimes filled with fish, sometimes with pears, sometimes with herbs nobody could pronounce even then. They were crunchy, chaotic, and beloved beyond logic. It's easy to think of medieval banquets as solemn affairs. All roasted boar and solemn toasts and overly long grace before meals. But hiding behind the grandeur was a deep love for the irregular, the surprising and the frankly absurd, like fritters that were folded into birds or birds folded into fritters depending on the ambition and perhaps sobriety of the cook. You settle onto a worn wooden bench near the kitchens. The firelight flickers across brass pans and iron spits. Somewhere batter sizzles. Here's your historical fact for the evening. By the 14th century, fritters had made their way into nearly every part of European cuisine, particularly during Lent and feast days. They weren't just peasant food. Nobles ate them. Monks hoarded them. Street vendors sang about them. If it could be chopped, dipped in batter, and fried, it probably was. And now for something delightfully odd. Some medieval recipes called for frying flowers. Actual flowers, rose petals, elderflower, even violets, tossed in batter sprinkled with sugar and served as a symbol of culinary elegance. You wouldn't believe how often a medieval noble wanted to chew on a daisy. Of course, this led to some unintended chaos. Once during a spring feast in Burgundy, a tray of flower fritters caused confusion because half the guests assumed they were medicinal poultices. The other half thought they were decorative garlands. Only 2 people dared to eat them and were promptly praised for their innovative palate. You lean closer to the imagined pan. The sound of bubbling oil feels comforting, like rain but with purpose. Fritters had more than just culinary presence. They made noise. They gave off scent. They lingered on fingers and robes. You didn't eat a fritter quietly, you performed the act of eating it. Crunch, puff, drip, sip. Lick fingers, repeat. And just like that, you begin to notice a pattern. In monasteries, these fritters took on holy dimensions. Some monks, particularly in Spain, believed the perfect bubble in a fritter was a sign of divine favor. A kitchen with flat fritters, spiritually suspect. A kitchen with airy, crisp ones, probably blessed. No pressure, Brother Gregory. And if we dig a bit deeper, here comes our gentle academic debate. Was the medieval fritter more than just food? Was it a kind of performance? Was the sound of sizzling batter the medieval equivalent of music in a poor village? Was a tray of fritters a kind of edible festival? Consider this: in some regions, fritters were only made during specific full moons believed to ward off bad luck or bring fertility. In rural areas of France, unmarried women would gather to fry them together, and the one whose fritter puffed up the most was declared luckiest in love. There's probably an entire doctoral thesis waiting in that. And remember, not all fritters were sweet. Savory ones ruled the scene. Herbs, onions, garlic, shredded fish, even leftover porridge, yes. Porridge could be fried into a puck of culinary mystery. One chronicler from Norwich described a fritter as containing God's mystery and man's leftovers. A little dramatic but relatable. By now the scent is thick around you. Imaginary or not, it's convincing: oil, flour, sugar, rosemary, heat. You feel as if your fingers should be greasy, your breath warm, your smile lazy. You reach toward the imagined tray, take a bite, a crunch like parchment being folded, then soft, then steam, then something sweet you didn't expect, followed by a sharp hint of pepper. The kind of bite that makes you forget the century. This was the joy of medieval fritters. They weren't about balance or nutrition or dignity. They were about delight. A spoonful of surprise in every shape. A moment of play during otherwise rigid days. And now, as the kitchen's fire dims and the imaginary tray empties, you lie back. Let your body sink into the scent of flour and thyme. You may forget the names, the recipes, the confusing flour choices. But tonight your breath carries the memory of oil singing, of batter dancing, and of joy fried in small golden portions. That's the fritter story for tonight. Crunch carefully into your dreams. Tonight your feet crunch across the gravel courtyard of a medieval monastery long after the sun has slunk behind the hills. The moon is a polished coin overhead, and there's the faint smell of yeast soot and something unmistakably cheesy in the air. You're not here for prayer, not tonight. You're here for a legend, a culinary one. The monk who invented a 5-layer cheese pie to outdo a rival abbey. Yes, this is a tale of monk's mischief and medieval dairy. Step carefully now, don't trip on the ivy curling over the old stone wall. The kitchen is warm and golden from candlelight, and the cook is stirring something viscous and bubbling in a pot that smells both divine and dangerous. He's muttering. You listen closer. Too much almond milk and it curdles. Not enough and Brother Julian wins again. You've arrived just in time. This part of the story begins not in the grand halls of kings, but in the quiet war between monasteries, each vying for culinary prestige at feast days. And what better battlefield than the ancient festival of St. Crispinian, when the fast lifts and dairy rejoices. You might have expected solemnity, but here it's culinary chaos with a side of scripture. Each abbey has its own signature dish. One is known for marzipan pears sculpted into swans. Another is famous for sugar-glazed turnips that sparkle like relics. But our focus, the Abbey of Saint-Germain and the cheese pie that broke both records and stomachs. Let's break it down layer by holy layer. The bottom crust was made from ground rye barley and a whisper of wheat, stolen from the grain cellar because the cellarer was asleep or perhaps bribed with figs. The second layer, a soft cheese folded with egg yolks and herb ash. The third, almond milk custard with grated nutmeg. The fourth, hard cheese shaving soaked in ale. And the top, a crust brushed with saffron and carved with the initials of 3 saints. Not one of them had anything to do with cheese. The result, it was delicious and borderline heretical. Now here's your historical fact. Monasteries were not just centers of prayer, but of innovation, especially in the kitchen. They experimented with food preservation, fermentation, and spice trade routes. Cheese, in particular, was a monastic specialty. Soft cheeses like Neufchâtel, hard wheels like Cantal, all had monastic cousins. But here's the quirky side note. At least one monastery had a rotating job titled cheese taster. A brother whose literal divine calling was to taste cheese for safety and sanctity. The notes he left behind include phrases like, too sharp for vespers, and sings in the mouth but weeps in the stomach. Now back to the pie. You'd think such a dish would earn reverence. But in the next feast cycle, St. Julian's Abbey responded with a pie of their own, this time with pickled fruit, layered fish mousse, and a surprise hazelnut crust. Things escalated quickly. Within a year, the competition grew so intense that a bishop had to intervene, urging the monks to consider the humility of the Lord and not stack pies to heaven. Officially, the feast was simplified. Unofficially, the cheese pie continued in secret. And what was once rivalry turned into ritual. Each year, monks gathered late at night behind kitchen doors, slicing pie and offering silent judgment. Some say the tradition continues in certain corners of France, hidden in stone halls and candlelight. Now let's pause just for a moment. Picture yourself in that kitchen. The warmth, the candle shadows dancing over copper pots. The quiet laughter as a monk accidentally sneezes into a bowl of custard and everyone pretends not to notice. The smell of browning crust-rich cheese and roasted apple. It's not grandeur that makes history, it's moments like this. You wonder, was this really about competition? Or was it simply a way to pour their love skill and secret mischief into something edible? Here's your academic question. Were monastic food rivalries a vehicle for innovation or merely symbolic feasting arms races? Do we honor them for creativity or chuckle at the theological shade thrown with every extra layer of cheese? And now, as the tale winds down, imagine the final slice of pie being served. The crust cracks softly under the weight of a wooden spoon. A bite melts on the tongue, sweet, salty, sacred. One monk sighs and says, "Brother Julian would never think to add pear jam." And the others nod, already plotting next year's improvements. History isn't always war or kings or cathedrals. And sometimes it's cheese. Sometimes it's the whisper of pastry in the dark. And sometimes it's you wrapped in warmth, listening to tales beneath the hush of night. Tonight you're not in a feast hall. You're crouched beside a cold oven in a crumbling stone kitchen. The scent of smoke has faded into the bricks. The last turnspit dog has retired. All that's left is a whisper of poultry grease and pride. Because tonight you're visiting a forgotten corner of medieval cooking, the food made when no one was looking. This isn't banquet fare. This is the food made by kitchen boys after hours. The roasted goose too burnt for the Lord's plate. The candied peel that never set. The pigeon that fell behind the bread oven and got cooked anyway. Accidents maybe. Improvisations always. Let's talk about one particular accident of flavor that became a quiet legend: stuffed feathers. Not stuffed birds, stuffed feathers. Think of it as the medieval chef's inside joke, plucking a peacock clean, then refilling its feathers not with meat, but with spiced porridge. It sounds odd, but picture it, the illusion of grandeur shimmering on the outside, soft barley on the inside. They did it partly for fun, partly to confuse guests, partly because someone dropped the roast and had to improvise. Tonight's story is a celebration of those improvisations, culinary cover-ups, happy mistakes, and glorious substitutions. Because not every medieval kitchen had saffron or swan. Most had barley garlic, a blunt knife, and one bold apprentice willing to fake it till he made it. Take, for example, the rebasted pheasant. Once upon a Tuesday, the Lord's prized bird burned while the cook argued with the steward about flour rations. The apprentice saved it by peeling off the blackened skin, mashing walnuts with wine and garlic, then reapplying the whole thing like makeup. Did it taste like pheasant? No. Did it impress? Absolutely. There was a silent code in these kitchens. A kind of culinary theater that played with illusion meat that wasn't meat, pastry that wasn't flour, and sauces that whispered instead of shouted. You pass by a cooling rack now, except it's a piece of driftwood with holes poked in. Someone used it to rest boiled dough spirals. The dough was flavored with river herbs dyed with crushed apple skins, then dried beside the chimney. Were they good? Who knows? But someone tried, and let's not forget bread stunts. One young baker, desperate to stretch barley flour during a poor harvest, mixed in dried moss and pine ash. The result surprisingly edible. Better yet, the Lord declared it an earthy delicacy. So for a while, pine ash loaves became trendy. The kitchen became a lab of edible ambition. If the stew was bland, add pickled grape skins. If the fish collapsed, serve it on a toast raft. If the toast burned, say it was charred in the Italian style. No one had ever been to Italy, that made it better. You're smiling now, I can feel it. Not because the food sounds delicious, though some of it might have been, but because it's so wonderfully human. So very, we did our best. The thing is, these improvisations weren't just about saving face. They were about joy, pride, the secret thrill of knowing you fooled a noble's palate with turnip paste. Some historians wonder, were these tricks shared between kitchens? Did one apprentice pass a moss bread recipe to another by whispering across the chapel during Mass? Did failed goose disguises become folklore? We don't know. But we do know this: the kitchens remembered. They remembered what worked, what didn't. Who cried when their almond cheese split? Who laughed when the cat stole the eel? And somewhere deep in those fire-darkened walls, the scent of cinnamon still lingers from a spiced plum pudding that never made it to the Lord's table but fed a hungry stable boy. So tonight as you drift off, think of that pudding. Not the perfect feast, but the saved mistake, the clever fix, the hidden feast for one. Because sometimes the best stories aren't served in gold bowls. They're scraped from iron pans and shared by candlelight. You find yourself back in the great stone kitchens. Not the royal ones this time, those echo too much and smell of old politics, but the kitchens of a countryside abbey where the monks wear wool in secrets. The air is warm, thick with rising steam and the scent of barley. You're not quite sure how you got here, but the monks don't seem to mind. One of them hands you a wooden spoon like it's the most natural thing in the world. Tonight's menu, soup, just soup, or so they say. But this is not the watered-down cabbage brew you might expect from a fast-day fryer. No. This is something else. Something layered. Something whispered. Something perhaps rehearsed by candlelight in quiet defiance of austerity. You stir and you notice barley pearls, bits of turnip carved like runes, hints of wild garlic. The broth is murky, yes, but it shines like it's been prayed over. And maybe it has. One of the monks leans over and taps the pot, smiling. It's a recipe from Brother Matthias, he says. He got it in a dream. Now that would be weird anywhere else, but here it fits. You ladle the soup into humble bowls. The steam curls upward like incense. The monks don't speak while they eat. It's a sort of spiritual slurping. Every motion is careful, practiced. Their chewing sounds like a liturgy. This is food not just to sustain, but to center. Tonight you learn that monks had to follow strict fasts for nearly half the year. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. But they didn't always follow them literally. You discover recipes for mock cheese made from almond paste and vinegar and pseudo-sausages made of lentils, walnuts, and spices shaped into links. There are even tales of fish being carved into fake legs of lamb to satisfy rules and palates alike. One record from a 14th century priory in Burgundy describes a feast, yes, a feast held entirely during a fast. It was technically legal. All ingredients were permitted, but the result was outrageous trout stuffed with fig and herb, puree eel pies glazed with honey custards made from rice milk and almond cream. Monks, it turns out, could be gourmet rule benders, and the debate begins. Were these monastic fast dishes a loophole, a quiet rebellion, or simply a creative way to embrace hardship with joy? Historians still puzzle over the ethics of it. Were these meals an act of devotion or indulgence in disguise? You notice a small bowl at the edge of the table. It looks simple, beige, mild. But the monk beside you takes a bite and sighs like he's just heard a hymn. You try it. It's a pudding, made from oat milk, raisins, a touch of pepper. Sweet but restrained, like joy held gently in one hand. You understand in that moment that this wasn't cheating. It was a form of worship through food. Not excess, but excellence. The candlelight flickers lower. One monk begins to hum. Another stands and brings in a clay pot, sets it before the group. You all lean in. From the pot emerges something you never expected, a small root sculpture shaped like Saint Benedict holding a ladle. Everyone chuckles quietly. Monastic humor. But it's also dessert. Apple slices soaked in spiced wine layered between rye bread crisps. It's art. It's homage. It's holy snacks. You look around realizing you've just taken part in something rare. A moment of balance, of rule and imagination, of simplicity wrapped around sophistication. Somewhere outside, bells begin to ring for Compline. Night prayers. The monks gather their robes, bow their heads, and begin to file out. But not before one of them turns to you and says, "Come again next week. We're trying almond butter roast with nettle glaze." You don't laugh. You just nod, already tasting it in your mind. And as the candles burn low and the soup cools and the silence returns, you lie back against the warm stone wall, feeling not full, but fulfilled. Tonight's fact: medieval monks observed over 150 fast days per year. Tonight's quirky detail: some monasteries had designated cooks trained only in fast day feasts, blending theology with culinary innovation. Tonight's debate: were elaborate fast meals acts of piety or palate-pleasing loopholes? Either way, your dreams will smell faintly of almond cream and garlic broth. The next morning, you're awakened not by trumpets, but by the rich, buttery scent of roasted oats and honeyed cheese wafting through a crooked window slit. You're still lodged in a merchant's guest house, one that prides itself on its rooftop oven in view of the weekly goose parade. You stretch slowly, letting the sun gild your thoughts, and make your way down to the communal table where your host, a plump woman in a flour-dusted tunic, has already laid out a simple but majestic spread: toasted bread, sheep's cheese, nuts, and today's star, a bowl of tiny pickled quail's eggs dyed with saffron. And that's when the debate starts again. Today's topic: the most confusing, contradictory, and ceremonially important course of the medieval feast, the entremet. Not quite appetizer, not quite dessert, not quite food. Sometimes a joke, sometimes a threat, often a swan. Entremets were elaborate dishes presented between courses, though dish is a generous word. Some were edible and artistic, others were mostly performance. Imagine a pastry castle complete with tiny trumpeters that play when you cut into the ramparts. Or a roasted peacock redressed in its feathers and posed mid-screech. Or a gelatinous pie that bleeds red wine when sliced. Theater, illusion, edible symbolism, all served between the roast and the final wafers. You nibble a walnut and wonder aloud why. Why make food so elaborate it becomes terrifying? Your host grins, because the nobles were bored and afraid. It's a theme now, isn't it? Feasting was as much politics as pleasure. Displaying wealth meant more than serving meat. It meant showing that your meat had a message, that you could afford a team of cooks, sculptors, musicians, illusionists, and animal handlers just to present a single interlude. Some entremets were moral lessons. Others were allegories. Some were pure chaos. There's one famous account of an entremet called the Four Elements, in which each course represented earth, fire, water, and air, complete with glowing coals, live fish, wind machines, and dirt. There's another story, maybe true, maybe not, about an entremet presented to King Charles VI of France. It was a life-sized sugar garden with a fountain that spouted rose water. A little too sweet, perhaps. But then again, Charles was rumored to believe he was made of glass, so maybe this was calming. And yet not all entremets were grand. In smaller homes, people made symbolic treats on holidays: a bread shaped like a lamb, or a small pie with hidden charms. They weren't theatrical, just thoughtful. A quiet ritual of transformation made edible. You sip warm cider and think about modern cakes with surprise centers, or cupcakes with toy rings hidden inside. Maybe we never really stopped. One of the strangest entremets recorded was a meatball served to look like a baby's head. Another, a swan whose chest opened to reveal a smaller cooked bird inside. In fact, the entire trend of stuffing animals inside other animals, turducken being the modern descendant, likely evolved from these excessive spectacles. Let's pause here to acknowledge the cooks. You think cooking today is hard? Imagine trying to roast a whole deer, redress it in its hide, pose it like it's alive. Insert fireworks in its mouth and time the whole thing to arrive precisely between the third and fourth course. Medieval cooks were not just chefs. They were engineers, designers, and occasionally pyromaniacs. And what did it all mean? That's the question. Some historians argue that entremets were expressions of power and anxiety. A feast was a way to ward off famine and remind everyone who could still afford surplus. Others see them as religious symbols, resurrections, miracles, moral plays. One open debate asks, were these entremets for the guests or for the host's ego? You reach for another quail egg and laugh. Maybe both. The tradition fades as you move past the 15th century. Printing, presses, trade shifts, changing tastes, they all slowly turn the page. But every so often, a modern dinner party features a dramatic centerpiece, a fake cake, a dry ice cocktail, and history winks. You wipe your fingers and prepare to move again. Outside, the goose parade is in full swing. Children chase the waddling birds while their parents sip broth and argue about spices. You walk among them quietly, already imagining the next chapter. And behind you, someone calls out, "Did you see the meat pie shaped like a crown?" You don't turn. You just smile. Because by now, you know, the story is never just about the food. It's about what the food dares to become. The hallway is cooler than the feast hall. You step into its stone silence like stepping out of a warm bath into evening air. Echoes hush here. Even your footsteps feel embarrassed, softer than they were before. Someone has swept rose petals all along the corridor, crushed here and there under heel, but mostly still whole. Their scent is ghostly and sweet, and at the end of the hallway, of course, is the pantry. Not just a pantry, the pantry. This one has a name passed down like a title. They call it the King's Mouth, because whatever went in did not come out. Tonight the door is open, and inside a memory of cold. Butter wrapped in bracken. Bread that never saw the light of day. Pears from 2 summers ago, their skins like folded parchment. Jars of pickled quail eggs. A wheel of cheese so old it has a personality now, sour, judgmental, and vaguely French. This is where food goes to sleep, but not forever. Everything here waits for a feast, for a famine, for a royal tantrum. You pick up a dried sausage just to feel the weight of it. Dense, heavy with spice and history. One of the cooks once told you these sausages are seasoned with nutmeg, pepper, and a bit of royal gossip. That last part may have been metaphorical, or not, but you don't linger too long. The pantry has rules. No eating in silence, no weeping over dried figs, and absolutely no talking to the cheese. Tonight's story begins with a pig. Not just any pig, but the contest pig of 1384. The king, bored after a long winter, declared that no feast would begin until someone presented the most unexpectedly stuffed animal. You might think people would draw the line at stuffed birds with other birds inside them. But no. The line was somewhere way, way further. This pig, you see, was not stuffed with apples. No, it was stuffed with jellyfish, dates, 2 boiled eels, and reportedly a pastry shaped like a bishop. The pig was carried in on a platform. It took 6 men. Not because it was heavy, but because they were laughing too hard. Some say the pig squealed as it was roasted, not from pain, but from the sheer indignity of the recipe. Did it taste good? Absolutely not. Did it win the king's approval? Naturally. He called it culinary heresy and gave it a medal. And that was just the start. For the next 2 decades, nobles across the land tried to outdo one another with the most bizarre, overstuffed roasts. One family once served a deer filled with trout, filled with chestnuts, filled with a tiny marzipan knight. It became a culinary arms race, and like all arms races, it led to absurdity. At one point, a roast was served that required a manual. Yes, a parchment scroll sat beside it titled, "How to Survive the Course." And survive they did, though some needed to nap dramatically under the table. But here's the thing. Underneath all the pageantry, there was a quiet rebellion brewing among the cooks. They were tired of roasting pheasants inside swans, inside boats made of dough, of pretending cabbage could be armor, of sculpting custard to resemble royalty. So in secret, they started a game. They called it the Simpler Feast. Once a year, they'd gather after the king slept and cook only 3 ingredients. No stuffing, no sculpting, no fireworks. Just onions, oats, and lamb. They called it a relief. Tonight, you sit with them. You stir the oats. You salt the lamb. You roast onions until they turn to jam. The cooks smile. One of them hands you a spoon heavy with steam. And in that moment, with no trumpets, no velvet napkins, no jellyfish pigs, you understand something. Simplicity was the boldest dish of all. Here's your historical fact. Medieval kitchens did experiment with elaborate multi-animal roasts, including mythical beasts recreated from parts of various creatures, often for entertainment more than nutrition. Here's your quirky detail. In one French banquet, a roast boar's mouth was made to speak using a hidden pipe and bellows. Here's your scholarly debate. Were these feasts a reflection of abundance or a reaction to fear of scarcity masked in spectacle? Now set the spoon down. Let the warmth settle in your chest. The pantry closes behind you, not with fear, but with finality. You walk back down the hallway, petals cling to your shoes. Tomorrow the cheese may still judge you, but tonight you've cooked something real, and that's enough. Tonight you're standing in the shadow of a vast stone hearth, its chimney so wide it could swallow a wagon. Smoke curls upward, heavy with the scent of roasted fowl and something sweet, clove, no, maybe mace. Or is it dried rose petals again? The medieval kitchen is a puzzle box, and each pot on the fire holds a mystery. Welcome to the royal kitchen during banquet season, where recipes are political strategies and every ingredient is a message. In this part of our journey, we explore how food wasn't just nourishment, it was theater diplomacy and sometimes petty revenge. You peer closer into a cauldron where a single swan floats wings artfully tied in a triumphant pose. Its beak is painted gold. The cook whispers it's not actually cooked. Its boiled skin stuffed, then dressed again in its own feathers. So it still looks alive. You nod, totally normal. And beside that, a pie the size of a helmet. A lid is gently lifted. Doves fly out, real ones. The guests clap, the children scream. Someone drops a goblet in surprise. This isn't dinner, it's pageantry. In medieval courts, especially in France and England, banquet dishes were meant to awe. And not just the guests. Sometimes the host too. Kings competed to out-weird one another. Like Charles VI of France, who once served roast peacocks with their tails set on fire. Or Richard II, who commissioned entire cookbooks just to make sure his goose pudding was the most regal in Christendom. You tiptoe past an apprentice arranging a hedgehog-shaped pudding. It's made from minced pork, studded with almond spikes. At the next station, a castle of jelly trembles gently. Inside it, boiled quails. Because why not? And in this edible wonderland, spices were the loudest signal of power. Cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, not just for flavor. These were import symbols of wealth, flexed with the same bravado as gold chains and velvet cloaks. A lavish dish wasn't just tasty, it was a spreadsheet of trade routes and imperial ambition. Here's a curious fact: medieval cooks didn't hide the illusion. Everyone knew the peacock wasn't really breathing fire, or the pie wasn't born with birds inside. But that was the point. It was about mastery, not deception. The goal wasn't to fool, but to dazzle, and sometimes to taunt. There's a tale of one banquet where a nobleman slighted in court sent his rival a dish of cooked deer stuffed with notes mocking his lineage. Another dinner ended with the host revealing a pig shaped like a monk roasting on a spit, a not-so-subtle jab at the local clergy. And then, of course, there's the condiment diplomacy. A well-timed bottle of spiced wine sent to the Pope's table, political olive branch. A guest served last and handed dry bread without butter declared war. Food wasn't neutral, it never is. Your hands are warm from the hearth now. You settle near a bench lined with linen napkins so fine they could double as veils. The head cook wipes sweat from his brow and whispers, "They want something bigger next week. A fish that looks like a lamb." Think we can do that? You consider suggesting tofu, but instead you nod solemnly. In the margins of medieval cookbooks, those illuminated manuscripts with gilded borders and sticky pages, you sometimes find doodles. Tiny pigs with wings, fish riding horses. Maybe it was a joke, or maybe a frustrated apprentice dreaming of a world where food could escape the politics and just be strange for fun. Tonight's history lesson leaves a scent on your skin: clove ash and stewed apricot. You weren't just learning what they ate. You were listening to how they spoke without saying a word. And now, as the kitchen dies down and the jelly castles slump, you imagine yourself holding a spoon shaped like a scepter, tasting something that tastes like power and sugar and salt and showmanship. 3 closing thoughts. Medieval diners loved a surprise, even if it meant chasing doves through a chandelier. Culinary arms races are older than gunpowder. Somewhere, someone still dreams of a fish dressed like a sheep. Time to pull your blanket up, let the warmth simmer. You're full now, not just in the belly, but in curiosity. The hall smells of saffron and wood smoke. Not fresh saffron, mind you. This is the kind that's been hiding in a pouch in a pantry behind some old ledger books long enough to forget who it once was. But it still burns like gold in the broth. Tonight you're following the scent to the kitchens below a half-forgotten monastery. Not one of the grand ones, this place has moss between the flagstones and prayers that sound like wheezing. And yet the feast preparation underway here could give any royal household a run for its coins. Because in the Middle Ages, even monks could show off. Quietly, subtly, one saffron thread at a time. The stew being stirred in that huge blackened pot, it's pottage, yes. That humble, endlessly recycled peasant staple. But tonight it's a feast day pottage, which means someone snuck in almond milk, crushed herbs, maybe even a suspiciously out-of-season apricot. Let's not ask questions, let's just taste. You sit on a worn bench, your back warm from the wall's lingering heat, and sip from a wooden spoon. The texture is creamy, the flavor both grounded and floral like thyme met honey, and they shook hands awkwardly. This is what culinary rebellion looks like when vows of humility apply. Here's the thing, medieval kitchens were more innovative than we give them credit for. Sure, they boiled everything. But they also smoked, pickled, fermented, baked, roasted, and when feeling ambitious, made entire birds look like mythical beasts. Monks especially were experts at stretching ingredients, bending rules, and hiding flavor bombs inside modest dishes. Take the mortrus, for example. It sounds like something you'd feed a dragon, but it's actually a spiced meat paste often made from chicken or pork, thickened with breadcrumbs and softened with almond milk. Rich, delicate, and shaped into tiny domes or served in hollowed bread, it was basically the pâté of piety. There's even a monk somewhere who managed to create a version using lentils, mushrooms, and a splash of ale, so no meat yet still scandalously good. Now let's talk about the real showstoppers, illusion foods. Ever seen a fish that turned out to be pork, or a hard-boiled egg that was actually almond custard inside a painted shell? Welcome to the land of medieval culinary theater. This was food as performance made to honor saints, impress bishops, and remind everyone that restraint didn't mean blandness. One chronicled example, a roast swan sewn back into its feathers, posed as if in flight. Yes, swan, imagine plucking it, roasting it, then lovingly redressing it. If that's not devotion or madness, I don't know what is. And here's your quirky detail: on certain feast days, monks were known to serve musical beans. These weren't enchanted legumes, but rather boiled broad beans with mustard, which, let's say, encouraged communal participation after supper. Now that's a prayer circle with echo. We've talked before about symbolic food. In monastic kitchens, everything had a metaphor. Fish represented Christ, round loaves reminded you of eternity, and bitter herbs made you reflect on sin and possibly the cook's mood. One scholar argues that these meals were sermons in edible form. That's an academic way of saying your lunch was trying to teach you something. So here's the debate. Did medieval monks actually enjoy this food, or were they just very good at pretending? Some letters from visiting nobles suggest envy. Their larder is humble, wrote one lord, yet the flavors are fit for kings. Meanwhile, a grumpy novice once scribbled too much fish. And Brother Peter sings to his cheese again. Perhaps both are true. You're now leaning back, eyes closed, as a final course is served, frumenti. It's just boiled wheat with almond milk and a dash of saffron again, but somehow it tastes like comfort got a degree in theology. A warm hush settles over the kitchen. Outside, a bell rings. Inside, a spoon scrapes an empty bowl. You were expecting silence. You got flavor instead. And somewhere in your modern memory, a part of you notes, hey, I might try almond milk porridge tomorrow. See, medieval monks still starting food trends, one fast day feast at a time. The fire has dimmed, but the feast rages on, at least in your imagination. Tonight you are seated not in a throne room but in the bustling wooden kitchens behind one. The air is thick with heat smoke and a dozen overlapping conversations. Boots shuffle, pans clang, a goose hisses indignantly as it's carried by its ankles past your head. And in the center of it all, a pie. But not just any pie, a pie with claws. Hey guys, tonight we're diving fork first into the strange and splendid world of medieval meat pies and the birds, beasts, and baked illusions that filled them. This will get flaky, possibly feathery, maybe even animatronic. Before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your evening's journey elbow deep in flour. The pie dough is being worked with all the love of a grumpy mason slapping mortar on a cathedral wall. But this crust isn't just a container for food, it's a showstopper, a structural marvel, a medieval Tupperware made of wheat and ambition. The cook beside you mumbles about larks. You nod. He mutters about hedgehogs. You pretend to nod again. He whispers something about a swan cooked but posed as though a live feathers reassembled meticulously like some kind of feathery taxidermy Lazarus. Yes, you've arrived at the golden age of medieval spectacle pies, the haute cuisine equivalent of stage magic. Here's a historical fact. At royal feasts, it wasn't enough for food to taste good, it had to look amazing, tell a story, or even perform. One of the most famous examples is the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie concept, where live birds were placed into pies that when cut open would fly out and astonish the guests. Yes, live birds inside a pastry. Your pie doesn't chirp, but it does leak a suspicious amount of something that smells like venison and mystery. The kitchen boys laugh. One winks at you. You suddenly worry that your pie might walk off the table before the night is over. That's the thing about these pies, they weren't just food, they were pageantry. One recorded example from a banquet of Charles V featured pies containing mechanical singing birds. Another presented entire scenes sculpted in dough castles under siege dragons, knights jousting with pastry lances. It was part dinner, part theater, part medieval flex. And it wasn't just about impressing guests. These dishes carried political weight. To serve a pie in the shape of your noble family's heraldry, or better yet, to make your rival's crest explode in goose gravy, was a delicious kind of diplomacy. You reach for the pepper because, of course, no medieval dish is complete without it. In fact, pepper was such a prized commodity, it was sometimes used in lieu of currency. The amount sprinkled on these meat pies could be a down payment on a small manor house. Suddenly you hear a commotion from the banquet hall. Trumpets blare. The pie parade begins. You follow the line of servers as they carry the evening stars on elaborate trays. One pie looks like a unicorn. Another appears to be breathing smoke thanks to clever use of herbs and hidden embers. And yours. Yours is vibrating. It reaches the high table. A knife is raised. Your pie emits a squeak. 3 rats bolt from its crust, scampering across the cloth. The nobles gasp. One child cheers. A noblewoman faints very politely. Congratulations. You have just served the most memorable dish of the night. Here's a quirky detail in some places, especially during 12th night celebrations. Surprise pies were common. They could contain treasures, riddles, even live musicians. In one French record, a whole man dressed as a minstrel supposedly sprang from a pie singing madrigals. How he breathed in there, that's a mystery no historian can explain. Now here's your academic debate. Were these pies primarily acts of culinary art, or were they tools of social manipulation? Did they dazzle for the sake of joy or to establish a visual hierarchy of power and ingenuity? You wander back to the kitchen, still laughing. Your hands smell like sage and fear. The cook pats your back and says, "Next time, fewer rats." But deep down, you know there's magic in a crust that surprises. And as the kitchen cools and the final pies are served, you curl up in a corner, imagining all the strange things that can hide in dough. Birds, dancers, messages. maybe even dreams. The morning begins with mist, not just in the air, but in the kitchen too. Somewhere in the back of a medieval banquet hall where torches flicker and wood creaks like old bones, a cook named Elfrida is steaming something that looks like a pie, smells like a pond, and sounds like a dare. Tonight you've entered the world of aquatic roasts. Yes, you read that right. Fish, frogs, eels, and sometimes things best left unnamed paraded not boiled or fried, but roasted like they were poultry with ambition. And that ambition to star in the strangest feast of the century. The nobles are restless. One lord wants a roasted swan with fireworks. Another demands a peacock stuffed with a trout stuffed with a quail. But the king has heard whispers of a delicacy from the riverbanks of East Anglia. A roasted pike. But not just roasted posed as if leaping. Its mouth wired open with a gold thread. Its eyes replaced with polished green stones, and its belly stuffed with minced herbs and something suspiciously like cherries. You watch as Elfrida leans over the fire, adjusting the spit. The pike looks triumphant, ridiculous, beautiful, slightly terrifying. But let's step back. Why roast river creatures at all in the medieval mind? Water beasts lived between worlds, wild yet tameable, common yet exotic. The church promoted fish on fasting days, yes, but nobles took it further, transforming the humble eel into a spectacle worthy of legend. Here's a popular truth: roasted meats were central to medieval feasts. But water-based roasts offered a peculiar blend of piety and pageantry. And now for something weird. In 1429, a bishop's banquet featured a roasted beaver tail served whole and oiled to shimmer like dragon skin. Apparently, beaver tail was allowed on fasting days because it came from the water. That's ecclesiastical loopholing at its finest. And here's your scholarly pickle. Were these aquatic roasts genuine culinary innovations or edible stage props to outfeast the competition? Some argue it was less about taste, more about theater. The fish didn't even need to be eaten. It just had to look heroic enough to impress a visiting duke or confuse him. Back in the smoky kitchen, Elfrida is testing sauces. One is creamy and green, like it's made from swamp herbs and pride. Another is bright yellow, dangerously cheerful, and smells like mustard met a melon in a back alley. She plates the pike. The herbs spill slightly. The cherries peek out. A garnish of edible petals crowns its fishy forehead. And when she carries it through the corridor, you follow the scent trail like a knight on a culinary quest. In the hall, the pike receives applause. Applause for a fish. There are rumors that another noble once roasted a dolphin. Let's not unpack that. Instead, imagine the psychological warfare of feasts. Who could present the most magnificent roast? Who dared to turn dinner into allegory? A salmon posed as a knight. An eel curled like a sleeping dragon. A trout impaled on rosemary and symbolism. It wasn't just food, it was power on a plate. And yet in the quieter kitchens, cooks laughed. They knew no one actually liked cherry-stuffed pike. But no one would admit that, not while the king was chewing thoughtfully, pretending he didn't just bite a stone eye. You linger near the back, taking in the heat, the chaos, the pride of a cook who knows her roast fish is less about flavor and more about folklore. Later, after the applause, the nobles drift off. The leftovers return to the kitchen. The pike's gold thread is saved. The stones removed and wiped clean. They'll be used again, maybe in a roasted eel dressed like a scholar. Elfrida wipes her brow. She hums. She prepares another. Because in the world of medieval aquatic roasts, the show must go on. And you drift into sleep with dreams of leaping fish and sauces that defy logic. Tomorrow's feast. You hear rumors of a roasted crab served with a poem. But that's a story for another night. Tonight you're following smoke. It curls like a ribbon down the stone corridor. It smells not quite like food and not quite like perfume, but something strange in between cinnamon feathers and fire. You walk barefoot through the hall, the flagstones cold under your toes, and turn the corner into a dining room. A feast, sort of. There's a goose on the table, or perhaps a peacock. No, wait, it's a swan. Its feathers are somehow still intact, lacquered in gold. Its eyes are glass marbles. Its beak is painted crimson. You're not sure if it's looking at you, Nathan, or judging you. This is not a hallucination. This is a real thing that happened. Often, welcome to the world of medieval illusion food. The pageant of the plate where cooks were part magician, part sculptor, and part chaotic poet. We're not talking about your modern unicorn cakes or burger-shaped cupcakes. No. These were edible fantasies commissioned by kings and bishops to impress, intimidate, or maybe just confuse everyone at the table. One of the most infamous examples, the four-headed beast, a roasted calf with the heads of pigs, goats, and birds sewn onto it. Why? Because why not? Imagine the look on your cousin's face if you served that at Christmas. Another classic, a roasted chicken stuffed with live sparrows. When you cut it open, the sparrows flew out, creating an indoor bird tornado. This was called an entremet, not a dessert, more like an edible stage play. You begin to understand that medieval cuisine was less about nourishment and more about narrative. Each course was a story, each dish a statement. Sometimes the statement was, I have more money than common sense. You pass by an enormous sugar castle, yes, castle, complete with spun sugar guards and a jelly moat. It took 4 weeks to build, and 10 seconds for the king to poke it with his knife, just to see if it would fall. Even the drinks had drama. Some were dyed bright blue with lapis-infused vinegar. Others were served flaming in chalices carved from fruit. Here's the thing, medieval illusion food wasn't just fun, it was dangerous. One English duke tried to serve a roasted boar with fireworks in its mouth. It exploded a little too enthusiastically. 2 guests lost eyebrows. Then there was the time someone gilded a fish with actual mercury, not realizing that shiny poison is still poison. A dozen monks fainted. One sang psalms in reverse for an hour. Some scholars debate whether these feasts were truly common or just rare spectacles. Others argue the records exaggerate for effect because medieval chroniclers, they loved to embellish. But the artifacts remain. Recipe books like the Viandier and Forme of Curie contain elaborate instructions. How to make a deer look like a dragon. How to serve a pie with a mechanical bird inside. How to make almond milk cheese look exactly like marzipan gold. What's even more fascinating, illusion food wasn't just for the rich. In festivals and town fairs, humble cooks created their own versions, bread shaped like saints, fish cakes arranged to look like a rose. It was play. Play with food. Play with perception. Play with expectation. Even monks joined in. On feast days, they made edible reliquaries, tiny sugar sculptures of saints' bones arranged like relics, then passed around and eaten reverently. Crunch. So tonight, as you drift further into this soft candlelit world, imagine you're at a banquet. The table groans under the weight of impossible dishes. A rabbit wearing a pastry crown, a trout floating in a blue gelatin sea, a fig tree that bleeds honey when cut, and somehow in the corner, there's a potato. Just one, unassuming. Boiled. Plain. Because even the most flamboyant feast needs something honest to lean on. Your historical fact. The word subtlety used to mean an edible illusion, not a flavor note, but a visual trick. Your quirky detail. One medieval cook tried to roast an entire cow from the inside out using hot rocks. The result, a very angry cow and a singed ceiling. Your academic debate, were these feasts tools of power or acts of art or both? You don't have to answer. Just breathe. Let the scent of sugar and fire drift away. Let the illusions melt. The room is quieter now. The feathers settle. The jelly moat shimmers in candlelight. You're still lying in the warm glow of imagination. And the swan isn't judging you anymore. Hey friends, tonight we reach the end of our long and smoky banquet. A feast of stories. A table that stretched across centuries. We've roasted swans and sang about hedgehogs. We've seen pastry become a weapon of pride and watched kings argue over golden forks. We've sipped spiced wine that could knock out a monk and followed kitchen boys who shaped the politics of a hall without ever speaking a word. And now the last dish has cooled. But don't worry, we're not ending. We're letting it rest like a pot left on a hearth to gather memory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Let's dim the lights, start a fan for that cozy background hum, and settle into this final stretch. Tonight you sit at a table carved from stone. A banquet in the mountains, no music, no trumpets. Just you, a plate of cold roast peacock, and the ghosts of every meal you've met. You reach for the last slice. It's been shaped like a mythical beast, wings of marzipan, eyes made of clove's tail feathered with syruped thyme. You eat it slowly because it's not just a dish, it's a riddle. A memory surfaces the banquet where the King of Naples ordered a pie so large it contained 24 musicians playing lutes. Yes, that really happened. In 1474, another memory, a scribe's account from Burgundy, where servants roasted a camel because no one dared say they couldn't find one. And then the moment when Eleanor of Aquitaine served an army of monks nothing but candied violets and peacock eggs just to prove she could. Do they taste good? Not always. But that wasn't the point. Medieval cuisine wasn't only about flavor. It was about theater, status, alchemy. You weren't just fed, you were shown your place and asked to applaud. Here's your historical fact. At royal banquets, it was common to cook animals in unnatural shapes. A pig might be sewn to a goose, then lacquered gold and served whole. These were called subtleties, food as illusion, and the strange detail. Sometimes the animals were served still breathing, not because they hadn't been cooked, but because they were replaced after cooking with live ones dyed and dressed to look like the original dish. It was a culinary magic trick, slightly horrifying, extremely popular. And now the scholarly question, were these displays about power or fear? Did kings need bigger birds and weirder pies because they feared being forgotten? Did the dinner table become a place to prove existence through extravagance? You chew slowly and the feast unrolls behind your eyes like a scroll, a monk hiding saffron in his sleeve to spice the bishop's soup. A noblewoman eating candied artichokes at dawn to fight melancholy. A child laughing as a sugar castle collapses into boiled cream. The banquet ends not with a bang, but with silence. A full hush. Even the ghosts lean back in their chairs. You rise. The mountain breeze lifts your hair. You are full not just of food, but of time. So if tonight your dreams smell faintly of clove-roasted venison, or you wake up thinking you heard the distant sound of lute music beneath pastry crust's smile, it means you were there. You were always there. Thank you for dining so gently across these 30 parts with me. For savoring each dish with your ears, your imagination, your calm. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace. And now, that's the last plume, the final feather drifting down through the candlelit air. The fire has gone out. The laughter of lords has faded. Even the roasted phoenix, if that's what it was, has cooled to silence. But you're still here, breathing, resting, remembering. Maybe tonight you'll dream of a golden goose that tells riddles. Or of a king who baked an entire feast inside a swan. Or of a quiet jester who stole a sausage and rewrote a legend. Whatever it is, let it be strange. Let it be tender. Let it be yours. Thank you for walking through the banquet halls of absurdity with me. For every snore masked as a chuckle, every blink that turned into a doze, thank you. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.